Montana Territory, 1874. The spring sun cast long shadows across Eagle Ridge's town square, but did nothing to warm the chill that had settled over the gathered crowd. Their breaths formed small clouds in the crisp morning air as they stood in silence, faces etched with a mixture of morbid curiosity and shame. In the center of the square stood a wooden post, weathered by years of Montana winters. Tied to it was a woman, her dress torn at the back, exposing pale skin, already marked by 3 angry red welts. Her copper hair, once neatly pinned, now fell in tangles around her face, but her posture remained unbowed. Even in humiliation, Eleanor Sullivan stood tall. Mayor Holden cleared his throat, unfolding an official-looking document with theatrical slowness. His voice carried across the square, made stronger by the unnatural silence of the crowd. For the crime of insulting a respected citizen of this town and refusing a lawful marriage agreement, Eleanor Sullivan is sentenced to 10 lashes to be administered publicly as a reminder of a woman's proper place in our society. A few feet away, Wesley Blackwood watched with thinly veiled satisfaction. At 48, the former Confederate colonel cut an imposing figure in his tailored suit, his silver-streaked beard neatly trimmed, his eyes cold as Montana stone. Samoan. He nodded to the deputy holding the whip, a silent command to continue. The deputy raised his arm, and the crowd drew a collective breath. 4, Eleanor counted silently, bracing herself for the next strike. She had learned during the war to separate her mind from physical pain, to observe it as something happening to her body, but not defining her consciousness. As a field nurse in the bloodiest years of the Civil War, she had witnessed suffering beyond imagination. Her own pain was nothing by comparison. The whip cracked again, and fire bloomed across her back. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, refusing to cry out. She would not give Blackwood that satisfaction. "That's enough." The voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd, deep and commanding. The gathered townspeople turned as one toward the sound parting to reveal a tall man astride a chestnut stallion. Dust still clung to his long coat, suggesting a hard ride. James Harrison dismounted, his movements fluid despite his imposing frame. At 38, lines etched his once handsome face like a topographical map of a hard-lived life. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and his gray eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen too much death. But it was the quiet authority in his bearing that caused the deputy to lower the whip. "This doesn't concern you, Harrison," Mayor Holden said, visibly annoyed at the interruption. "This is town business. I'm making it my concern." Harrison's voice remained level as he approached the post, his hand resting casually near his holstered Colt. "The woman owes a debt," Blackwood interjected, stepping forward. "Her father borrowed money. She can repay it through marriage or face the consequences of refusal." Harrison turned to Eleanor, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Miss Sullivan, did your father owe this man money?" Eleanor lifted her chin, her green eyes blazing despite her condition. "My father never borrowed a cent from Wesley Blackwood. This is a fabrication to seize my father's property and papers." "Delusions of a disobedient woman." Blackwood laughed, though the sound held no humor. "Thomas Sullivan signed agreements." "Which no one has seen," Eleanor interrupted. "Convenient that you only mentioned this debt after his death." Harrison stepped closer to Blackwood. "I'm only going to say this once. Cut her down or I'll do it myself." "You're outnumbered, Harrison." Blackwood nodded towards several rough-looking men positioned around the square. "Hired guns, not townspeople." "Wouldn't be the first time," Harrison replied, his voice dangerously soft. The crowd had fallen silent, sensing the violence hovering in the air, like the metallic tang before a lightning strike. Harrison counted 6 of Blackwood's men. Bad odds, but he'd faced worse. "Mr. Blackwood," Harrison said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'd like to speak with you privately about this matter." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, but curiosity won out. "5 minutes, Harrison, then the punishment continues." They stepped away from the crowd behind the mercantile building. The moment they were alone, Harrison seized Blackwood by his expensive lapels, shoving him against the wall. "I know who you are, Blackwood. Or should I say Colonel Blackwood of the 18th Virginia." Blackwood's eyes widened slightly before his face settled into a smirk. "And I know you, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison of the Union Army, the hero of Chancellorsville." "Or was it the butcher?" Harrison's grip tightened. "I need an accommodation. The woman. What's the actual debt?" Blackwood straightened his jacket as Harrison released him. 500, but it's not about the money. Thomas Sullivan had information, documents that rightfully belong to me. I'll pay the debt. 500 in gold. You drop all claims against Miss Sullivan and her property. Since when do you have that kind of money, Harrison? I've been ranching for 7 years. Unlike some, I didn't need to steal to rebuild after the war. A flash of anger crossed Blackwood's face before he controlled it. 500 won't buy my silence about what happened at Chancellorsville, about Lieutenant Sullivan and his men. Harrison felt a familiar coldness settle over him, the battle calm that had served him well during the war. I'm not buying your silence. I'm buying her freedom. The rest is between us. Blackwood studied him, calculating. Very well. 500 in gold, and I relinquish all claims against Eleanor Sullivan. A cruel smile played at his lips. But she should know who her savior is, the man responsible for her brother's death. That's my burden to bear, Harrison replied. Do we have an agreement? Blackwood extended his hand. We do. But this isn't over between us, Harrison. Not by a long shot. When they returned to the square, Eleanor remained bound, her face pale but composed. Blackwood addressed the crowd. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Harrison has generously offered to settle Thomas Sullivan's debt in full. He nodded to the deputy. Release her. As the ropes fell away, Eleanor swayed on her feet. Harrison moved forward to steady her, but she flinched from his touch. Dr. Winters pushed through the crowd, draping a blanket over her shoulders. She needs immediate medical attention, the elderly doctor said, glaring at Mayor Holden. This barbarism has no place in a civilized town. Take her to my ranch, Harrison said quietly. It's safer than the town. I'll bring supplies. Dr. Winters nodded, helping Eleanor toward his wagon. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Some supportive of Eleanor, others criticizing her defiance. The townspeople of Eagle Ridge, like most frontier settlements, were a mixture of the honorable and the opportunistic. As Eleanor was helped into the wagon, her eyes met Harrison's. There was no gratitude in them, only weariness, and something deeper, a recognition, perhaps, that she'd traded one form of bondage for another. Harrison watched the wagon pull away, then turned to find Blackwood watching him with cold amusement. She doesn't know who you are, does she? The former Confederate officer asked. No, Harrison replied, and it's going to stay that way. Blackwood's laugh followed him as he mounted his horse. We'll see, Colonel, we'll see. The rolling hills outside Eagle Ridge gradually gave way to open country as the wagon carrying Eleanor made its slow journey toward Harrison's ranch. With each jolt of the wooden wheels over the rutted trail, Eleanor bit back a groan. The pain from her lashed back radiated through her entire body, but she refused to show weakness even in front of the kindly Dr. Winters. Almost there, my dear, the doctor said, his weathered face creased with concern. Harrison's place is just beyond that rise. Eleanor nodded, too exhausted for words. Her mind drifted, memories washing over her like waves, the crowded field, hospitals during the war. The endless screams, the smell of blood and chloroform, the letters from Michael that grew increasingly distant as the war dragged on, and then the official notification of his death at Chancellorsville. The wagon crested the hill, revealing a sprawling ranch nestled in a valley between rolling hills. A two-story house of hewn logs stood at its center, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and fields of alfalfa. A clear stream cut through the property, reflecting the afternoon sun like a ribbon of silver. It's beautiful, Eleanor murmured, surprised by the thought. Harrison built it himself after the war, Dr. Winters replied. Came here with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back. Most folks thought he wouldn't last a winter. Now he runs one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. They pulled up to the main house. Harrison was already there, having ridden ahead. He stood on the porch, speaking quietly with an elderly Native American woman. As the wagon approached, she nodded and disappeared inside the house. Harrison helped Dr. Winters lift Eleanor from the wagon, careful to avoid touching her wounded back. Despite his gentleness, pain shot through her, momentarily darkening her vision. When her sight cleared, she found herself being carried in Harrison's arms, his face a mask of concern above hers. I can walk, she protested weakly. Save your strength, he replied, his voice unexpectedly soft, as he carried her into the house, into a small, clean bedroom. The Native American woman was there arranging supplies on a bedside table. She nodded to Eleanor with kind eyes set in a face marked by years and wisdom. This is Naomi Falling Water, Harrison explained. She's a healer from the Paiute settlement. She'll tend to your wounds better than any doctor. I'm still here, you know, Dr. Winters grumbled good-naturedly as he entered with his medical bag. Harrison stepped back suddenly awkward. I'll leave you to it. After he left, Naomi helped Eleanor lie face down on the bed. With practiced hands, she cut away the torn dress, exposing the full extent of the damage. Dr. Winters inhaled sharply. Barbarians, he muttered. 5 lashes, and they broke skin on each one. You strong, Naomi said in halting English as she began cleaning the wounds. Most cry. You no cried I. Crying doesn't help, Eleanor replied, her voice muffled against the pillow. I learned that in the war. You healer too, Naomi observed, not a question. I was a nurse, Army of the Potomac. Dr. Winters nodded approvingly as he prepared a tincture of laudanum. Battlefield experience. That explains your composure. My father taught me that pain is just the body's way of speaking. It doesn't have to control the mind. At the mention of her father, both Dr. Winters and Naomi exchanged a glance that Eleanor didn't miss, despite her position. You knew my father well, she asked. Thomas Sullivan was the finest apothecary this territory has seen, Dr. Winters replied, measuring out the laudanum. And a good friend, his loss was significant. He helped our people, Naomi added, when others refuse. Eleanor closed her eyes, fighting back unexpected tears. Here at least were people who had valued her father. How did he die? She asked quietly. The telegram only said fever. Another significant look passed between the doctor and the healer, but before either could respond, Harrison appeared in the doorway with fresh linens. That's enough questions for now, he said firmly. She needs rest. He set down the linens and retreated, pulling the door nearly closed behind him. Dr. Winters administered the laudanum, and Naomi began applying a cool, fragrant salve to Eleanor's wounds. The pain began to recede, replaced by a floating sensation as the medicine took effect. Rest now, Naomi said softly. Tomorrow we talk more. As Eleanor drifted into a laudanum-induced sleep, her last conscious thought was of her father's kind face and the mysteries that seemed to surround his death. The Chancellorsville battlefield stretched before James Harrison, shrouded in gun smoke and the gathering dusk of a Virginia spring evening. The cannon's roar shook the earth beneath his feet as he surveyed the chaos through his field glass. 2,000 men under his command, with Confederate forces pressing in from 3 sides. The only path of retreat lay through a dense woodland to their east, a perfect place for an ambush, but their only hope. Lieutenant Sullivan, he called to a young officer with bright copper hair, take your men through that forest. Secure our retreat. Lieutenant Michael Sullivan saluted sharply. Yes, Colonel. How many men? Harrison hesitated, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. 23 should do it. Hand-picked. Your best. Something in Sullivan's green eyes told Harrison the young man understood what wasn't being said. It was a suicide mission. 23 men to draw Confederate fire so 2,000 might escape. It's been an honor, Sir Premier, Sullivan said quietly, tucking a small photograph into Harrison's breast pocket. If I don't return my sister Eleanor, she's a nurse at the field hospital in Maryland. Tell her I wasn't afraid. Harrison nodded, unable to find words, as Michael Sullivan gathered his men and disappeared into the tree line. 30 minutes later, gunfire erupted from the forest, and Harrison ordered the retreat. As his regiment marched to safety, he couldn't block out the sounds of dying men who had sacrificed themselves on his order. The last face he saw before leaving the battlefield was Lieutenant Sullivan, mortally wounded, propped against a tree, blood bubbling from his lips as he whispered his sister's name once more. Eleanor. Harrison woke with a start, cold sweat soaking his shirt, despite the warmth of the spring night. The dream was always the same, vivid, unrelenting, a perfect replay of that terrible day at Chancellorsville. 11 years had passed, but the faces of those 23 men still visited him nightly, especially Sullivan with those knowing green eyes. He rose from his bed, knowing sleep would not return. Moving quietly through the darkened house, he made his way to the sitting room, where an old upright piano stood against the wall, a relic of the previous owner that Harrison had never learned to play properly. Opening the lid that covered the keys, he revealed a small daguerreotype tucked into the wooden frame, the photograph Michael Sullivan had pressed into his hand before marching to his death. A young woman with fierce eyes and copper hair, so like her brother's. Eleanor Sullivan, though he hadn't recognized her immediately in the town square, beaten and defiant. Harrison closed the piano lid gently. The sister of Lieutenant Sullivan was sleeping under his roof, unaware that her host was the man who had sent her brother to die. The cruel irony of it all was not lost on him. Outside, the Montana night was clear, and still stars scattered across the vast sky like diamond dust. Harrison stood on his porch listening to the distant howl of a wolf and the soft lowing of cattle in their pens. He had built this place to escape the ghosts of the war, to lose himself in honest work and solitude. But the past, it seemed, was not so easily outrun. He thought of Eleanor Sullivan's eyes when she looked at him in the town square, wary, wounded but undefeated. She had her brother's courage. And now, by some twist of fate, she was here bringing with her all the memories and guilt he had tried to bury. Harrison remained on the porch until dawn, watching as the stars faded and the eastern sky blushed with the promise of a new day. Whatever storm was coming, and he felt certain one was, he would face it standing. Some debts could never be paid in full. But perhaps in protecting Eleanor Sullivan, he could begin to balance the scales that had been tipped so heavily by his order at Chancellorsville. For 3 days, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, the combination of physical trauma, laudanum, and exhaustion keeping her tethered to her bed. Naomi Falling Water came daily, changing bandages and applying her healing salves. Dr. Winters visited twice, pronouncing her healing well, but advising complete rest. Harrison kept his distance, appearing only briefly to check on her condition before retreating to the daily work of the ranch. Eleanor was grateful for the space. Each time she saw him, something nagged at the edges of her memory, a familiarity she couldn't place. On the fourth day, Eleanor woke with a clear head and a determination to rise. Her back still burned with each movement, but the fever had passed, and she was tired of feeling helpless. Carefully, she dressed in a simple shirt and skirt that Naomi had brought from town, the fabric loose to avoid irritating her healing wounds. The house was quiet as she made her way slowly to the kitchen. It was a spacious room with a large hearth, well-equipped but spartanly furnished. Through the window, she could see Harrison in the distance, working with cattle in a corral. The efficient movements of his tall frame suggested a man accustomed to physical labor. Eleanor found coffee still warm on the stove and poured herself a cup. As she sipped the strong brew, she took stock of her situation. She had come to Eagle Ridge to bury her father and settle his affairs, only to find Wesley Blackwood claiming ownership of the apothecary due to unpaid debts. Her resistance had led to public humiliation, and now she was recuperating in the home of a stranger who had paid a small fortune to spare her further punishment. Nothing was as she had expected. Her father's death had been described as sudden, a fever that took him quickly. But Thomas Sullivan had been an expert in treating fevers, having served as a battlefield surgeon before settling in Montana. It seemed unlikely he would succumb to an illness he knew how to treat. And then there was Harrison. Why would a reclusive rancher involve himself in her affairs? $500 in gold was no small sum, even for a successful cattle operation. Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Harrison entered, removing his hat and gloves. He stopped short when he saw her at the kitchen table. "You're up," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Should you be?" "I've been bedridden for 3 days," Eleanor replied. "Any longer and I'd go mad." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Naomi said you were stubborn." "Strong-willed," Eleanor corrected, taking another sip of coffee. "Thank you for the hospitality, Mr. Harrison, and for what you did in town." He nodded, pouring himself coffee before sitting across from her. "How much do you remember?" "Everything," she said simply. "I was humiliated, not unconscious." Harrison's gray eyes studied her over the rim of his cup. "Why did Blackwood want you to marry him?" Eleanor set down her cup, considering how much to reveal. "My father died 3 weeks ago. I returned from Chicago to bury him and manage his affairs. When I arrived, I found Blackwood claiming ownership of the apothecary due to debts my father supposedly owed him." "Supposedly?" "My father was meticulous about his finances. He never mentioned any debt to Blackwood in his letters to me, and I found no record of it among his papers." She met Harrison's gaze directly. "I believe Blackwood wants something my father had information, not the property itself." Harrison nodded slowly. "You said you came from Chicago. You're a nurse." "Yes, at County Hospital. Before that, I served with the Army of the Potomac during the war." She watched his face carefully as she added, "My brother was an officer. He died at Chancellorsville." Something flickered in Harrison's eyes, a shadow of pain quickly suppressed. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. Many good men died in that war. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Harrison moved to the window, his posture tensing as he looked out. Blackwood, he said grimly, and some of his men. Eleanor rose too quickly, wincing, as pain shot through her back. Why would he come here? To make trouble. Harrison retrieved his rifle from where it hung by the door. Stay inside. Eleanor watched through the window as Harrison stepped onto the porch to meet the approaching riders. Blackwood sat astride a black stallion at the head of 4 men, all armed and looking dangerous in the bright morning sun. Harrison, Blackwood called, reining his horse to a stop. Didn't expect to find you playing nursemaid. What do you want, Blackwood? Just being neighborly. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. Came to check on Miss Sullivan's recovery. She's recovering. Doctor's orders are rest and quiet, no visitors. Blackwood dismounted, signaling his men to remain on horseback. He approached the porch steps but didn't ascend. From her vantage point, Eleanor could see the cold calculation in his eyes. Governor Blair is making his quarterly visit to Eagle Ridge next week, Blackwood said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. I've brought Miss Sullivan an invitation to the reception. As one of the few professional women in the territory, her presence would be appreciated. Harrison didn't take the envelope. I'll convey your message. Anything else? Eleanor decided she'd had enough of being discussed as if absent. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, ignoring Harrison's warning glance. I'm well enough for visitors, Mr. Harrison, she said, her voice stronger than it had been earlier. She turned to Blackwood, her expression cooling. Though some are more welcome than others. Blackwood smiled, removing his hat. Miss Sullivan, I'm pleased to see you recovering from your unfortunate experience. You mean the public whipping you orchestrated? Eleanor's directness caused several of Blackwood's men to shift uncomfortably in their saddles. Yes, I'm recovering, no thanks to you. A regrettable misunderstanding, which has been resolved thanks to Mr. Harrison's generosity. Blackwood gestured to the envelope in his hand. I've brought an invitation to Governor Blair's reception next week. He specifically requested your presence. Eleanor's expression remained impassive, but Harrison noticed her slight stiffening at the mention of the governor. Please thank the governor for his consideration, she replied, but I'm not yet well enough for social engagements. The reception isn't for 8 days. Surely you will be recovered by then. Blackwood's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened. The governor was quite insistent. He has a particular interest in your father's work. My father was a simple apothecary. Was he? Blackwood smiled thinly. In any case, the governor will be disappointed if you don't attend. He's not a man who accepts disappointment gracefully. The threat, though veiled, hung in the air. Harrison shifted slightly, positioning himself between Eleanor and Blackwood. Your invitation has been delivered and acknowledged, he said. Now, unless there's other business, Miss Sullivan needs to rest. Blackwood studied them both for a long moment before replacing his hat. Very well. I'll inform the governor of your tentative response. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Miss Sullivan, I took the liberty of securing your apothecary while you've been indisposed. Wouldn't want anyone disturbing your father's valuable work. Eleanor stepped forward. You have no right. Actually, I do. As a town council member, I have a duty to secure abandoned businesses for public safety. You understand? Blackwood mounted his horse. Everything is exactly as you left it, though I did notice some of your father's journals seem to be missing. Most curious. With a tip of his hat, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following close behind. Eleanor gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. He's been through my father's papers, looking for something specific, it seems. And whatever it is, Governor Blair wants it too, Harrison agreed. I need to return to town immediately. Harrison shook his head. That's exactly what Blackwood wants. He's baiting you, trying to force you back before you're fully recovered. My father kept records of everything patients' treatment's town business. Eleanor turned to Harrison, her eyes intense. If Blackwood is searching for something in those records, she paused, then added with conviction, my father didn't die of a fever, I'm sure of it now. What makes you say that? Thomas Sullivan was the most knowledgeable medical practitioner in 3 territories. He wouldn't succumb to a common fever without recognizing the symptoms and treating himself. Eleanor's voice was tight with certainty. Something happened to him. Something connected to whatever Blackwood is searching for. Harrison considered this. Even if you're right, returning to town now is dangerous. Blackwood wouldn't have come here unless he was desperate to find whatever your father hid. I don't have a choice. Those records, that apothecary, they're all I have left of my father. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. But I won't ask you to involve yourself further. You've done more than enough. If you're going, I'm going with you, Harrison said firmly, but not until Dr. Winters says you're fit to travel and not without a plan. Eleanor looked as if she might argue, then nodded reluctantly. 2 more days then, regardless of what the doctor says, I'm returning to Eagle Ridge. As she turned to go back inside, Harrison caught her arm gently. Eleanor, what do you know about Governor Blair? She hesitated. Only that he was appointed by President Grant 3 years ago. He visits the county seats quarterly to handle territorial business. Her eyes narrowed. Why? Blackwood mentioned him too specifically. And your reaction when he mentioned the governor's interest in your father's work, you tensed. Eleanor's gaze dropped. My father mentioned the governor in his last letter to me, said he was looking into some irregularities in land transactions. Nothing specific. Land transactions involving Blackwood. Possibly. My father didn't elaborate. She met his eyes again. Why are you still helping me, Mr. Harrison? You've paid your debt to Blackwood. What's your stake in this? Harrison released her arm. Maybe I'm tired of standing aside while men like Blackwood and Blair take whatever they want. Or maybe you're seeking absolution for something. The words struck like a physical blow, but Harrison didn't flinch. Maybe I am. Does it matter? Eleanor studied him for a long moment. I suppose not. 2 days, Mr. Harrison. Then we go to Eagle Ridge. She disappeared into the house, leaving Harrison alone on the porch watching the dust settle from Blackwood's departure. The peaceful isolation he had cultivated for 7 years was shattered beyond repair. Ahead lay conflict, danger, and the resurrection of ghosts he'd tried to bury. Yet for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him that he'd thought long dead purpose. And perhaps, though he scarcely dared acknowledge it, the first flicker of hope. That evening, after a simple dinner of venison stew prepared by Naomi, Eleanor found herself drawn to the sitting room where the upright piano stood against the wall. In the fading light, she ran her fingers over the worn keys, pressing one softly to hear its slightly out-of-tune note. Do you play hum? Harrison's voice came from the doorway, startling her. A little, she admitted. My mother taught me before she died. I haven't had much opportunity in recent years. Harrison entered the room, lighting a lamp that cast a warm glow over the worn furniture. It came with the house. I never learned. Eleanor noticed that the piano lid was closed over the keys, and something about Harrison's careful avoidance of it piqued her curiosity. She lifted the lid fully, revealing the yellowed ivory beneath and a small photograph tucked into the wooden frame. Her breath caught. Even in the dim light, she recognized the image immediately, herself, 5 years younger, wearing her nurse's uniform from the early days of the war. The photograph her brother had carried with him. Eleanor lifted the daguerreotype with trembling fingers. Where did you get this? She whispered. Harrison stood frozen, his face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. I can explain. This was Michael's. Eleanor's voice rose slightly. He carried it with him and always. How do you have it? He gave it to me, before Chancellorsville. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor stared at Harrison, her mind racing to connect the pieces. You, she began, then stopped, the full realization dawning. You were there. You knew Michael. Harrison nodded slowly. I was his commanding officer. Eleanor sank onto the piano bench, still clutching the photograph. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, she whispered. The officer who ordered the forest mission. Yes. The single word contained volumes: acknowledgement, regret, the weight of command. Eleanor had read about Chancellorsville in the newspapers, about the Union regiment that escaped encirclement thanks to a diversionary action. 23 men sacrificed so 2,000 could escape, her brother among them. You sent him to die, she said, her voice barely audible. I sent him to complete a mission, Harrison corrected gently, one that saved thousands of lives. He knew the risks, they all did. Eleanor stood suddenly, her back protesting the quick movement. Why didn't you tell me who you were when we met? Would it have made a difference? Harrison asked. Would you have accepted my help if you'd known? I don't know, she admitted. The revelation had shifted everything, casting their interactions in a new light. This man who had shown her kindness, who had protected her from Blackwood, was also the man who had sent her beloved brother to his death. I searched for you after the war, Harrison said quietly, to return the photograph to tell you about Michael's courage. The address he gave me led nowhere. We moved frequently, following the armies. Eleanor looked down at the image in her hand. He wrote to me about you, before Chancellorsville. Said you were different from other officers, that you knew your men's names, their hometowns. Her voice caught. He trusted you. Harrison couldn't meet her gaze. He was right to. I wouldn't have sent him if there had been any other way. Was there? The question hung in the air between them, the same question Harrison had asked himself every night for 11 years. No, he finally said. The Confederate forces had us surrounded on 3 sides. Without clearing that forest path, 2,000 men would have been captured or killed. So 23 died instead. Eleanor nodded, her face unreadable in the lamplight. Thank you for your honesty, Colonel Harrison. She placed the photograph carefully back in its place and closed the piano lid. And thank you for paying Blackwood. Consider any debt to my family paid in full. She turned to go, but Harrison's voice stopped her. He asked me to tell you he wasn't afraid. He said the words spilling out before he could stop them. Those were among his last words. He wanted you to know that. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her back to him. Was that true? Yes, he died saving others. He knew what he was doing. She nodded once, still not turning. Good night, Colonel. After she disappeared down the hallway, Harrison remained in the sitting room, staring at the closed piano lid. The ghosts of 23 men seemed to hover in the corners of the room, watching, waiting to see if their sacrifice would find meaning in the living. Outside, a storm was brewing, distant thunder rolling across the Montana landscape, a fitting accompaniment to the tempest of emotions within the ranch house walls. That night, fever returned to Eleanor with a vengeance. Her wounds, aggravated by the day's activities, blazed with renewed inflammation. She tossed in her bed, caught between past and present reality and nightmare. In her delirium, she was back in the field hospital at Gettysburg, surrounded by the moans of dying men, the smell of blood and gangrene thick in the air. She moved among the cots, changing bandages, administering laudanum, writing final letters home for those beyond saving. Eleanor, a familiar voice called. She turned to see Michael, still in his lieutenant's uniform, unwounded, and smiling as he had been the last time she saw him alive. You promised you'd come back, she whispered. I never left, he replied, his form wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. I'm with you always, Ellie. It hurts, she told him, uncertain if she meant her physical wounds or the pain of loss that had never fully healed. I know, Michael said, his voice fading, but you're stronger than the pain. You always were. Eleanor reached for him, but he dissipated like morning mist, replaced by the stern face of her father. Find the truth, Eleanor, Thomas Sullivan urged. It's in the patterns. Always in the patterns. What patterns, Father, she called, but he too was fading, leaving her alone in a darkening void. So many ghosts, a woman's voice observed Naomi, falling water suddenly beside her. War ghosts, family ghosts, they follow you. How do I make them rest? Eleanor asked. Not rest, listen. Naomi pointed to a figure emerging from the darkness. Colonel Harrison, his uniform bloodstained, his eyes haunted. You're him, aren't you? Eleanor found herself asking. The colonel, Michael's colonel. Before he could answer, pain pulled her back to consciousness. She opened her eyes to find herself in the bedroom at Harrison's ranch. Her nightdress soaked with sweat, her back on fire. A cool cloth was pressed to her forehead, and as her vision cleared, she saw Harrison sitting beside her, bed concern etched on his features. Michael, she whispered, still caught between dream and reality. You've been calling for him, Harrison said softly. The fever came back. Dr. Winters is on his way. Eleanor tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp of pain. How long? You've been delirious for hours. It's nearly dawn. Harrison dipped the cloth in a basin of cool water and replaced it on her forehead. Naomi's brewing her fever remedy. Eleanor studied his face in the dim light of the single lamp. Now that she knew who he was, she could see the burden he carried, the weight of command, of decisions that sent men to their deaths, of surviving when others did not. I knew who you were, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I came to Eagle Ridge, I saw your name in the newspapers after Chancellorsville. Colonel James Harrison, the officer who saved his regiment through quick thinking and decisive action. Harrison's jaw tightened. Newspaper accounts rarely tell the whole story. No, she agreed softly. They don't mention the 23 men who made that decisive action possible. Why did you come here, Eleanor? If you knew who I was. She closed her eyes, the cool cloth a blessed relief against her burning skin. To understand, to see the man who sent Michael to his death, perhaps to hate you in person rather than from afar. And now, Harrison asked, his voice carefully neutral. Now I don't know, she admitted. You're not what I expected. Before Harrison could respond, the door opened and Naomi entered with a steaming cup. Drink, she instructed, helping Eleanor sit up enough to sip the bitter herbal concoction. We'll bring fever down. Eleanor complied, grimacing at the taste but trusting the old woman's knowledge. As the liquid warmed her from within, a curious calmness spread through her limbs. Rest now, Naomi said, taking the empty cup. Morning brings clarity. As the Paiute woman left, Harrison rose to follow, but Eleanor caught his sleeve. Stay, she whispered. Please, I don't want to be alone with the ghosts. Harrison hesitated, then nodded, settling back into the chair. I'll be here. Eleanor drifted into a more peaceful sleep, no longer haunted by battlefield memories. Harrison kept his vigil until dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the room with soft golden light. Dr. Winters arrived shortly after sunrise, his weathered face grim as he examined the infected wounds. The infection's deep, he said, preparing a syringe of morphine. She needs proper medical care, not just my country doctoring. The nearest hospital is in Helena, Harrison replied. She wouldn't survive the journey. Then we do what we can here. Winters administered the morphine, watching as Eleanor's pained expression eased slightly. She was one of the best nurses I ever worked with during the war. Served at Antietam, Gettysburg. Saved more lives than most of the surgeons. Harrison looked up sharply. You knew her during the war. Winters nodded, packing his medical bag. She was assigned to my field hospital for a time. Fearless girl would walk through artillery fire to reach wounded men. He paused, studying Harrison. She doesn't know, does she, that you've been carrying her brother's memory all these years? She knows I was his commanding officer. That's all she needs to know. The elderly doctor didn't seem convinced. Sarah's bringing her fever remedy. Between that and the quinine, we might get ahead of the infection. Keep her cool. Make her drink when she's conscious. He headed for the door, then turned back. She deserves the truth, Harrison, whatever it is. After Winters left, Harrison maintained his vigil, replacing the cool cloths on Eleanor's forehead as they warmed from her fever. Naomi returned with her medicines, brewing a strong-smelling concoction that she spooned carefully into Eleanor's mouth. You care for her, the old woman observed as she worked. More than debt. Harrison didn't answer, but Naomi nodded as if he had. War connects people. Blood connects stronger. By evening, Eleanor's fever had broken. Harrison, who had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, woke to find her watching him, her eyes clear for the first time in days. You stayed, she said, her voice weak but steady. He straightened, rubbing his stiff neck. How are you feeling? Like I've been trampled by cavalry. She attempted a weak smile, but a lie which I gather was in question. The infection was serious. Dr. Winters and Naomi pulled you through. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window where evening light filtered through the curtains. I said things during the fever. About Michael. You did. And about you, she turned back to him. I remembered who you were before you told me. I saw your name in the newspapers after Chancellorsville. Harrison's jaw tightened. Newspaper accounts rarely tell the whole story. No, she agreed. They don't mention the 23 men who made that decisive action possible. She shifted slightly, wincing. I hated you for years, Colonel Harrison. When the official letter came about Michael, it mentioned his heroic sacrifice, but not the circumstances. Later, I read about you in the papers, the hero colonel who would surely be promoted to general. I resigned my commission 3 months after Chancellorsville, Harrison said. No promotion. Why? He met her gaze directly. Because I couldn't send any more men to D, not even for the right reasons. Something in Eleanor's expression softened. I need water, she said, changing the subject. And then if you're willing, I'd like to hear about Michael's last moments from someone who was there. Harrison brought her water, then pulled his chair closer to the bed. For the first time in 11 years, he spoke openly about that day, the impossible situation, the decision that had haunted him. and the courage of 23 men who had marched into that forest knowing they might not return. Michael was the last one alive when I found him, Harrison concluded, his voice rough with emotion. He was propped against a tree, had taken 2 bullets to the chest. Confederate soldiers were already retreating. They had suffered heavy casualties from your brother's men. He paused, gathering himself. Michael asked if the regiment had made it through. When I told him yes, he smiled. His last words were your name. Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you for telling me. She reached out her hand, hovering uncertainly before settling on his wrist. Michael would understand why I can't forgive you yet, but he would want me to treat. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Harrison moved to the window, tension evident in his posture. Riders coming, at least 4. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Stay here. Eleanor struggled to sit up. Who is it? Can't tell yet, but we're about to have company. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the valley as 4 riders approached the ranch house. Harrison stepped onto the porch, rifle held ready but not aimed. As the riders drew closer, he recognized Wolf Shadow, the Paiute warrior accompanied by 3 younger men from the settlement. Wolf Shadow, Harrison called in greeting. What brings you here? The Paiute warrior dismounted, his weathered face grave. Bring warning, friend Harrison. Blackwood men ask many questions about you, about woman. Not good questions. Harrison nodded, lowering his rifle. Come inside. You've ridden far. In the kitchen, Harrison poured coffee while Wolf Shadow delivered his news. Blackwood's men had been to the Paiute settlement, asking about Harrison and Eleanor, making thinly veiled threats about government action against the tribe if they didn't cooperate. They searched for something, Wolf Shadow said. Something woman who heals' father had. Woman who heals? Harrison asked. Eleanor Sullivan, Wolf Shadow clarified. Her father saved my son when winter fever came 3 seasons ago. He good man, good healer. Teach our medicine woman many things. Did Thomas Sullivan visit your settlement often? Harrison asked, an idea forming. Wolf Shadow nodded. Many moons. Bring medicines, learn our ways too. Last visit he speak with Thundering Bear alone. Give him something to keep safe. Harrison leaned forward, interest sharpening his gaze. What did he give Thundering Bear? Not for me to say, Wolf Shadow replied. Thundering Bear is keeper of such things. But he say when daughter of Sullivan comes, she welcome in our camp. He rose from the table. I go now. Tell Thundering Bear you come soon with woman who heals. After the Paiute visitors departed, Harrison found Eleanor sitting up in bed, her color much improved, though she still moved with careful slowness. I heard voices, she said. Trouble. Information. Harrison replied, explaining Wolf Shadow's visit. Your father had connections to the Paiute I wasn't aware of. He may have left something important with their elder Thundering Bear. Eleanor's eyes widened. Father never mentioned that in his letters, but it makes sense. He had great respect for native healing practices, often incorporated them into his own treatments. She pushed back the covers, determined. We need to visit this Thundering Bear. When you're stronger, Harrison cautioned, another day of rest at least. Eleanor looked ready to argue, but was interrupted by a sharp rap at the front door. Harrison motioned for her to stay quiet as he moved to answer it, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. He opened the door to find Jimmy, the young man who had first alerted him to Eleanor's plight in town. Mr. Harrison, the boy gasped, out of breath from his ride. Der Winters sent me. There's trouble in town. Blackwood's men are searching the apothecary, tearing it apart. The doctor thought Miss Sullivan should know. Harrison glanced back to find Eleanor standing in the hallway, having ignored his instruction to stay put. When did this start? She demanded. This afternoon, ma'am. They've got Mayor Holden's approval, calling it an inspection for public safety. Eleanor's face hardened with resolve. We leave for town at first light, she told Harrison, her tone brooking no argument. Harrison nodded grimly. First light it is. As Jimmy rode back to town with a message for Dr. Winters, Harrison watched Eleanor's determined preparations. The fragile woman of yesterday was gone, replaced by a steel-spine survivor with a mission. It reminded him forcefully of her brother on that fateful day at Chancellorsville, the same resolve, the same unflinching courage in the face of danger. Tomorrow they would return to Eagle Ridge, stepping directly into whatever storm Blackwood was brewing. Harrison checked his weapons and supplies, preparing for a confrontation he had long avoided but now seemed inevitable. The peaceful isolation he had cultivated was shattered beyond repair. Ahead lay conflict, danger, and the resurrection of ghosts he'd tried to bury. Yet for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him that he'd thought long dead purpose. And perhaps, though he scarcely dared acknowledge it, the first flicker of hope. The journey to Eagle Ridge took most of the morning, the wagon moving at a careful pace to avoid jostling Eleanor's healing wounds. Harrison drove, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. They traveled in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The vastness of the Montana landscape seemed to discourage unnecessary conversation, as if words were too small for such an expanse. As they crested the final hill overlooking the town, Harrison reined the horses to a stop. From this vantage point, Eagle Ridge looked peaceful, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, with the church steeple and courthouse dome rising above the rest. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the main street bustled with the ordinary commerce of a frontier town. "It looks so normal," Eleanor murmured. "Hard to believe that just a week ago I was being publicly whipped in the town square." Harrison glanced at her, noting the steel in her voice. "People have short memories when it's convenient. Most of those townspeople will pretend it never happened." "I won't forget." Eleanor's eyes hardened. "And I won't let them forget either." They continued down into the town, drawing immediate attention. People stopped on the boardwalks to watch them pass, whispers following in their wake. By the time they reached the Eagle Hotel, half the town would know Eleanor Sullivan had returned, accompanied by the reclusive rancher James Harrison. The hotel was a two-story wooden structure with pretensions of grandeur, lace curtains in the windows, and a sign proclaiming Eastern Comforts above the entrance. The proprietress, Mrs. Abigail Porter, greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. "Miss Sullivan, what a surprise to see you up and about. And Mr. Harrison, you haven't stayed in town for years." She glanced between them, clearly wondering about the nature of their relationship. "How many rooms will you be needing?" "Two adjoining rooms if you have them," Harrison replied, placing coins on the counter, "for at least 3 nights. Mrs. Porter's eyebrows rose at the generous payment. "Of course. Second-floor rooms 4 and 5. They share a connecting door for convenience." Eleanor met the woman's insinuating gaze directly. "Perfect. Colonel Harrison is providing security while I attend to my father's business affairs. The connecting door will allow him to respond quickly if there's trouble." The use of Harrison's military rank wasn't lost on Mrs. Porter, whose demeanor shifted subtly to one of greater respect. "Of course, Miss Sullivan. Will you be reopening the apothecary?" "That remains to be seen." Eleanor accepted the room keys. "Is Dr. Winters in town today?" "He should be at his office. Shall I send word you are asking for him?" "Please do. And Mrs. Porter, I'd appreciate your discretion regarding our arrival, at least for a few hours." The older woman's face fell slightly at being denied the pleasure of spreading fresh gossip, but she nodded. "As you wish, Miss Sullivan, though I can't speak for those who saw you arrive." Once settled in their rooms, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, the journey having taxed her more than she cared to admit. Harrison checked both rooms, thoroughly examining locks and sightlines from the windows. "The apothecary is visible from here," he noted, looking down at the main street. "Blackwood has a man watching it." Eleanor joined him at the window. Below, a rough-looking man lounged against a hitching post opposite her father's shop. His posture was casual, but his attention fixed on the building. "He won't leave his post, even for meals," Harrison continued, "which means Blackwood is still searching, still hasn't found what he wants." A knock at the door interrupted them. Harrison motioned Eleanor back and drew his revolver before calling out, "Who is it, Doctor?" "Winters," came the reply. Harrison holstered his weapon and opened the door, revealing the elderly doctor carrying his medical bag. "Cautious, I see," Winters remarked, entering the room. "Good. Blackwood's been asking about when you might return, Miss Sullivan," rather insistently. "Has he been in the apothecary?" Eleanor asked. "Daily. Brings different men each time. Some look like hired muscle, others more official." Winters set his bag down. "Let me examine your back while we talk." Eleanor sat in a chair and unlaced the top of her dress, allowing the doctor to inspect her healing wounds. Harrison discreetly turned his attention back to the window. "The infection's cleared," Winters pronounced after a moment. "Naomi's remedies worked better than my medicines, I'd wager. You'll have scars, but you're healing well." "Thank you, Doctor." Eleanor readjusted her clothing. What else can you tell me about Blackwood's activities? The elderly man's face grew grave. He's been meeting with Mayor Holden and several town council members. Closed-door meetings at odd hours. He lowered his voice. And there's talk of Governor Blair arriving early before the official reception. Harrison turned from the window. How early? Day after tomorrow, according to Mrs. Holden. The governor requested private accommodations at the mayor's residence rather than the hotel. Eleanor and Harrison exchanged glances. Doctor, Eleanor said carefully, did my father ever mention any concerns about Governor Blair or Mr. Blackwood, perhaps regarding land transactions or town business? Winters hesitated. Thomas was cautious in his later months, kept his own counsel more than usual. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. But he did ask me about symptoms of certain poisons about 3 weeks before his death. Said it was for his medical reference journal. Eleanor's breath caught. What kinds of poisons? Those that might mimic natural illness. Arsenic primarily. The doctor's eyes were shrewd. I wondered at the time. Your father knew more about such things than I did. And you didn't mention this when he died, Harrison asked, an edge to his voice. I had no proof, only suspicion. By the time I arrived, he'd been dead several hours. The symptoms were consistent with typhoid fever. Winters looked at Eleanor apologetically. Without an autopsy, which Mayor Holden refused to authorize. Of course, Eleanor said, her voice tight. Thank you for telling me now. Winters packed his bag. Your father was a good man, Eleanor. This town was better for having him. He moved to the door, then paused. One more thing. The night before he died, Thomas gave me a small package to deliver to a man in Helena, a federal marshal named Hollister. I made the delivery as promised, but never knew what it contained. After the doctor left, Eleanor stood perfectly still in the center of the room, her face pale but composed. Harrison watched her, recognizing the rigid control of someone processing devastating confirmation of their worst fears. He was murdered, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Murdered for whatever he discovered. It seems likely, Harrison agreed. The question is, what did he discover, and what evidence did he send to this federal marshal? Eleanor moved to the window, gazing down at her father's apothecary. We need to access the shop tonight after dark. Agreed, but we need to be careful. If Blackwood's men are watching, they'll report back immediately. Then we need a distraction. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes bright with determination, and I believe I know just how to create one. As dusk settled over Eagle Ridge, Eleanor made her way to the Stagecoach Saloon, the larger of the town's two drinking establishments. Her entrance caused an immediate stir. Respectable women, especially unmarried ones, did not frequent saloons unless accompanying their husbands. She ignored the stares and whispers, scanning the room until she found who she was looking for. Jimmy Reeves, the young man who had ridden to fetch Harrison on the day of her public punishment, sat at a corner table with several other young cowboys. His eyes widened when he spotted Eleanor approaching. Miss Sullivan, he stammered, rising quickly. You shouldn't be in here. I need your help, Jimmy, she said quietly. You and your friends. It's about my father. The young man glanced at his companions, then back to Eleanor. Whatever you need, ma'am, we all respected Mr. Sullivan. He patched me up more times than I can count, never charged more than I could pay. Eleanor smiled gratefully. In about an hour, I need a distraction on the south end of town. Something noisy that will draw attention and Blackwood's men away from the main street. Jimmy didn't ask questions, simply nodded. We can manage that. Billy's got some blasting powder from the mine. Been wanting to try it out. Perfect. Just make sure no one gets hurt. She pressed a coin into his hand. For your trouble. Keep your money, Miss Sullivan. We're glad to help. Mr. Sullivan was good to all of us. Eleanor returned to the hotel where Harrison waited, dressed in dark clothing, with his revolver holstered at his side. It's arranged, she told him. South end of town in an hour. Harrison nodded approvingly. Good. While we wait, tell me about your father's system, the shorthand you mentioned. What should we be looking for? Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her skirts. Father developed a notation system for his most sensitive records. He used botanical Latin combined with numbers, plants, and their properties as a code for people and events. She smiled faintly. He taught it to me when I was a girl, said a good apothecary needs to protect certain information, especially about patients. Clever, Harrison remarked, and effective against someone like Blackwood who wouldn't recognize botanical terms. Exactly. Father kept 2 sets of journals. The public ones with ordinary patient information and his private ones with this special notation. Eleanor's brow furrowed. The private journals would be hidden, not obviously, but in a place that would make sense to another apothecary. Any ideas where? Several. There's a false bottom in one of the herb cabinets, a hollow space behind the bookshelf, and the cellar has some loose stones in the wall. Harrison checked his pocket watch. Almost time. Remember, if we're discovered, we leave immediately. No heroics. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Says the man who faced down 6 armed men to rescue me. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Do as I say, not as I do. They slipped out the back entrance of the hotel, keeping to the shadows as they made their way toward the apothecary. Just as they reached the rear of the building, a tremendous explosion rocked the south end of town, followed by shouts and the sound of running feet. Your young friends are thorough, Harrison murmured as he worked on the back door lock. Jimmy takes his responsibilities seriously, Eleanor replied, keeping watch. The lock gave way with a soft click, and they slipped inside the darkened apothecary. Eleanor immediately felt a rush of emotion, the familiar smells of herbs and tinctures, the comfortable clutter of her father's workspace. It was like stepping back in time to before everything had changed. Harrison closed the door softly behind them. Where do we start? Eleanor lit a small lamp, keeping the flame low. The herb cabinet first. It's the most accessible. They moved quickly through the shop, aware that their distraction wouldn't last long. The herb cabinet, a tall wooden structure with dozens of small drawers, stood against the back wall. Eleanor knelt before it, her fingers finding a hidden catch beneath the bottom drawer. The false bottom slid open, revealing an empty space. Empty, she whispered, disappointment evident in her voice. Blackwood found it, Harrison said grimly. Next location. Eleanor moved to the bookshelf, pulling several medical texts forward to access the wall behind. Her fingers probed the wooden paneling until she found what she was seeking, a small, well-disguised door. It swung open to reveal another empty hiding place. He's been thorough, Harrison observed. The cellar. Before Eleanor could respond, voices sounded from the street outside. Harrison immediately extinguished the lamp, plunging them into darkness. They froze, listening as 2 men approached the front of the shop. Waste of time, one was saying. Blackwood's had us searching for days. Whatever he's looking for ain't here. Not our job to question, the second replied. Just keep watch. He thinks the Sullivan woman will lead him to it. The men settled on the front porch, the creak of the boards suggesting they had seated themselves for a long vigil. Eleanor and Harrison exchanged glances in the darkness, both realizing they were now trapped in the apothecary. The cellar, Eleanor whispered. There's an outside entrance behind some bushes. We can exit that way. They moved silently toward the trapdoor that led to the cellar, lifting it carefully to avoid noise. The stairs creaked softly as they descended into the cool darkness below. Eleanor led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the space intimately. The cellar was small, primarily used for storing medicines that required cool temperatures. Eleanor moved to the far wall, feeling along the stones until she found what she was looking for, a loose stone that pivoted on a hidden hinge, revealing a cavity behind. This was his most secure hiding place, she whispered. He called it his vault. She reached into the opening, her heart pounding. Unlike the other hiding spots, this one was not empty. Her fingers closed around a small, leather-bound journal. Eleanor pulled it out, clutching it to her chest with a soft gasp of triumph. Is that it? Harrison asked, his voice barely audible. One of them, at least. Eleanor carefully replaced the stone. Let's go before they decide to check inside. They made their way to the cellar's outside entrance, a slanted door partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. Harrison eased it open slowly, checking for any signs of Blackwood's men before helping Eleanor out. They kept to the shadows, circling behind buildings until they reached the hotel's rear entrance. Once safely back in Eleanor's room, she placed the journal on the small writing desk, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation and fear. Harrison lit the lamp, casting a warm glow over the worn leather cover. My father's private journal, Eleanor said softly, his most recent one, judging by the date inscribed on the spine. She opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with neat handwriting, a mixture of normal text, and the specialized notation she had mentioned. Eleanor bent over the journal, her eyes moving rapidly across the pages. He was investigating land transactions, she murmured after several minutes. Government land being sold to private interests at a fraction of its value. Blackwood's name appears repeatedly along with Governor Blair's. Harrison leaned closer. Can you decipher it all? Most of it. Some entries use codes I'm not familiar with. Eleanor turned more pages, her expression growing increasingly troubled. This is worse than I imagined. According to my father, Blackwood and Blair weren't just manipulating land sales for profit. For what then? They were specifically targeting land with strategic value. Strategic for what? Eleanor looked up, her face pale in the lamplight. For control of water rights and transportation routes. And, she hesitated, for displacing the Paiute from their treaty lands. Harrison's expression hardened. Land grabs disguised as legal transactions. It's happening all over the territories. Father writes that he discovered a pattern government officials declaring Paiute land abandoned or reclassifying it as unsuitable for their needs, then reassigning it to settlers like Blackwood, who paid substantial bribes. Eleanor continued reading. He suspected Governor Blair was receiving a percentage of every transaction. That would explain their desperation to recover these journals. It's evidence of criminal conspiracy. Eleanor turned to the final entries, her breath catching. The last entry is dated the day before his death. He writes that he compiled evidence of 23 fraudulent land transactions and sent copies to a federal marshal named Hollister. The package Morrison delivered, Harrison confirmed, but he also mentions the final proof being hidden where only I would think to look. She closed the journal, frustration evident in her voice. What does that mean? Where would I think to look? Harrison placed a hand on her shoulder. You'll figure it out, but not tonight. We've pushed our luck enough for one evening. Eleanor nodded reluctantly, the exhaustion of the day catching up with her. The emotional strain of confirming her father's murder, combined with her still healing injuries, had drained her completely. You're right, we should rest. She carefully wrapped the journal in a handkerchief and placed it under her pillow. But tomorrow we need to learn more about this Marshal Hollister and what happened to the evidence my father sent him. Harrison moved toward the connecting door to his room. I'll ask around discreetly. If the marshal received evidence of corruption involving the territorial governor, there should have been an investigation. Unless the evidence never reached the proper authorities, Eleanor said grimly, or unless those authorities are also compromised. Harrison paused in the doorway. Get some rest, Eleanor. You're safe tonight. After he closed the door, Eleanor sat for a long while staring at the lamp's flame. Her father had been murdered for uncovering a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. She had his journal, but not the final proof he'd mentioned the evidence that would truly expose Blackwood and Blair. Where would only I think to look? She whispered to the empty room. What place or object held special significance to both her and her father? Something so personal that only she would understand its importance. Sleep claimed her before the answer came, her dreams filled with her father's voice trying to tell her something just beyond her understanding. Morning brought a flurry of activity to Eagle Ridge. The explosion at the south end of town, which had fortunately damaged only an abandoned shed, was the primary topic of conversation. Mayor Holden had ordered increased patrols, suspecting outside agitators might be responsible. Harrison left the hotel early, ostensibly to check on his wagon and horses at the livery stable. In reality, he was gathering information carefully, questioning people he trusted about federal marshals and any recent investigations in the territory. Eleanor remained in her room, studying her father's journal more thoroughly. The code was complex and some entries remained opaque even to her trained eye, but the overall picture was clear. Thomas Sullivan had documented a pattern of corruption that implicated both Wesley Blackwood and Governor Edmund Blair in a scheme to defraud the federal government and the Paiute tribe of valuable land. Around midday, a soft knock at her door startled Eleanor from her reading. She quickly hid the journal before answering. Naomi Fallingwater stood in the hallway, her weathered face grave. I come with news, she said quietly, from Wolf Shadow. You must hear. Eleanor ushered the elderly Paiute woman into her room, closing the door firmly behind her. What's happened? Governor Man, come early last night. Secret meeting with Blackwood Man at hunting cabin outside town. Naomi's dark eyes were troubled. Wolf Shadow's grandson, watch cabin. See many papers, maps of our land. Eleanor felt a chill. Governor Blair is already here. Are you certain? Naomi nodded. Young brave followed Governor Man from Fort Harrison yesterday. Come straight here, not stop. This changed everything. If Blair had arrived early and in secret meeting with Blackwood away from town, they were clearly planning something imminent. Naomi, did Wolf Shadow send any other message? The old woman reached into the pouch at her waist, withdrawing a small object wrapped in soft leather. He say, give this to you. Say your father wants you to have when time right. Eleanor unwrapped the object with trembling fingers. Inside lay a small brass key with an unusual serrated edge. She stared at it uncomprehending. What is this for? Joseph not know. Your father give to him before death. Say keep safe for Eleanor. She know when to use. After Naomi left, Eleanor examined the key more carefully. It wasn't a door key or a cabinet key, too small, wrongly shaped. Yet it was definitely a key to something. She turned it over in her palm, noting a tiny engraving near the head, THS 1871. Her father's initials and a date 3 years ago. What had happened in 1871 that was significant enough for her father to mark it on this key? Eleanor was still pondering this question when Harrison returned, his expression grave. We have a problem, he said without preamble. Governor Blair arrived last night secretly. He's staying at a hunting cabin outside town, not at the mayor's residence as announced. I know. Naomi just told me. Eleanor showed him the key, and she brought this from Wolf Shadow. My father left it with him before he died. Harrison examined the key. Any idea what it opens? No, but it's marked with my father's initials in the year 1871. Eleanor frowned. I was in Chicago then, working at the hospital. Father visited me that summer, the only time he ever left Montana during those years. Eleanor's eyes widened suddenly. The music box. What music box? Father brought me a music box from Chicago in 1871. Said it was a gift, but he kept it at the apothecary until I returned. Eleanor's excitement grew. It has a decorative lock that I always assumed was purely ornamental. I never tried to open it because the winding key for the music mechanism is on the bottom. A second hidden compartment requiring a specific key, Harrison said, catching her enthusiasm. Hiding in plain sight. Exactly. Eleanor moved toward the door. We need to get that music box. Harrison caught her arm. Not now. The street is too busy and Blackwood's men will be watching more carefully after last night's break-in. He glanced out the window. Tonight after the governor's reception. The reception, Eleanor frowned. We're not attending, surely. On the contrary, Harrison's face took on a grim smile. I believe it's time we accepted the governor's gracious invitation. It will give us the perfect opportunity to access the apothecary while Blackwood and his men are occupied at the courthouse. Eleanor considered this a bold strategy, but risky. Sometimes the most direct approach is the least expected, she agreed. Harrison's eyes held a glint of the tactical acumen that had once made him a formidable officer. Besides, I think it's time you met the man responsible for your father's death, don't you? A cold determination settled over Eleanor's features. Yes, I believe it is. As twilight descended over Eagle Ridge, the courthouse windows blazed with light. Lanterns illuminated the entrance where a small but enthusiastic crowd had gathered to catch a glimpse of the territorial dignitaries arriving for the governor's reception. Inside, the main courtroom had been transformed with bunting flowers and tables laden with refreshments, a display of civilization in the frontier wilderness. The town's prominent citizens mingled with territorial officials, all dressed in their finest attire. Eleanor entered on Harrison's arm, wearing her best dress, a deep green silk that complemented her copper hair and brought out the color of her eyes. The garment had been carefully altered to avoid pressure on her healing back. Harrison wore a formal black suit that transformed him from frontier rancher to distinguished gentleman, though the revolver concealed beneath his jacket suggested he hadn't entirely abandoned practicality for appearance. Their entrance caused a stir among the assembled townspeople. Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares and whispered comments, but held her head high. 1 week earlier, she had been publicly humiliated in the town square. Tonight, she walked among them as an equal, her dignity restored. Mayor Holden approached them immediately, and his expression a mixture of surprise and unease. Miss Sullivan, Mr. Harrison, we hadn't expected you to attend. The governor specifically requested my presence, Eleanor replied coolly. It would be impolite to decline such an honor. Holden's discomfort increased visibly. Yes, well, he's currently engaged with some territorial officials. I'm sure he'll be available shortly. As the mayor retreated, Harrison leaned close to Eleanor's ear. Blackwood is watching from across the room. He looks concerned by our appearance. Eleanor didn't turn to look. Good. Let him worry about what we might know. They circulated through the reception, accepting refreshments and engaging in polite conversation with those brave enough to approach them. Most of the townspeople maintained a respectful distance, unsure how to interact with a woman they had recently seen whipped in public, now moving confidently among them. Dr. Winters joined them briefly, ostensibly to inquire after Eleanor's health, but actually to murmur, "Governor Blair asked about you specifically before you arrived, wanted to know if you'd been through your father's papers." This confirmation that they were being watched only strengthened Eleanor's resolve. The music box was their target for the night, but this reception provided an opportunity to observe their adversaries up close to gauge their concerns and priorities. After nearly an hour, a hush fell over the gathering as Governor Edmund Blair made his formal entrance into the main reception area. He was accompanied by Wesley Blackwood and several officials Eleanor didn't recognize. The governor moved through the crowd with practiced charm, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, gradually working his way toward where Eleanor and Harrison stood. "Miss Sullivan," he said when he finally reached them, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "a pleasure to finally meet you. Your father spoke highly of your accomplishments in nursing." Eleanor offered her hand with outward composure, though inwardly she recoiled at contact with the man she believed had ordered her father's murder. "Governor Blair, you knew my father well. We had several illuminating conversations about territorial development." Blair's smile didn't reach his eyes. Thomas Sullivan was a man of strong opinions and civic-mindedness. His passing was a great loss to Eagle Ridge. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, holding his gaze. "A sudden and unexpected loss." A flicker of something caution perhaps crossed the governor's face before his politician's mask slipped back into place. He turned to Harrison. "And Colonel Harrison, your reputation precedes you, a war hero turned reclusive rancher. What brings you out of isolation?" Miss Sullivan required assistance after her unfortunate experience. Harrison's voice was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. "I believe in supporting those who have been wrongfully treated." Blair nodded, glancing between them. "Admirable. I understand you settled a financial matter with Mr. Blackwood on Miss Sullivan's behalf, quite generous for someone with no prior connection to the family." The implication hung in the air that Harrison's involvement was suspicious, perhaps motivated by something other than altruism. "I dislike seeing power abused," Harrison replied evenly, "particularly against those unable to defend themselves." "A noble sentiment," Blair's smile thinned. "Though I find that most situations are more complex than they initially appear. Wouldn't you agree, Miss Sullivan?" "Indeed, Governor," Eleanor responded. "Like my father's investigation into territorial land transactions, quite complex, as I understand it." The direct reference to her father's work caused a momentary falter in Blair's composure. Beside him, Blackwood stiffened visibly. "Thomas had many interests," Blair recovered smoothly, "though I wasn't aware he was investigating anything official. That would be the purview of territorial authorities." "My father believed in justice, Governor." Eleanor's voice was steady. Even when pursuing it might be inconvenient for some. The challenge in her words was unmistakable. Blair's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, the cordial mask slipping to reveal something colder beneath. "Miss Sullivan, I would welcome a private conversation about your father's work. Perhaps tomorrow I'm sure we could clarify any misunderstandings." "I look forward to it, Governor," Eleanor replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. As Blair moved on to greet other guests, Blackwood lingered, his gaze calculating. "Playing a dangerous game, Eleanor," he said quietly. "Your father didn't understand the stakes either, until it was too late." Harrison stepped forward, slightly positioning himself between Eleanor and Blackwood. "That sounded remarkably like a threat, Blackwood." "Merely an observation, Colonel." Blackwood's cold smile returned. "Eagle Ridge is a hazardous place for those who pry into matters that don't concern them. Accidents happen frequently in frontier towns." With that parting remark, he followed the governor, leaving Eleanor and Harrison standing in tense silence. "He all but admitted to murdering your father," Harrison murmured, "and threatened the same fate for us." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "We need that music box tonight." They remained at the reception for another half hour, maintaining appearances while observing the interactions between Blair Blackwood and the other officials. The governor kept glancing in their direction, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the evening progressed. When the opportunity presented itself, Harrison and Eleanor slipped away from the courthouse. The streets were relatively deserted, most of the town's prominent citizens being at the reception. Even the guard usually posted outside the apothecary had been reassigned to the courthouse for the evening. They approached the apothecary from the rear as they had the previous night. This time, however, Eleanor led them not to the shop but to the side staircase that accessed the living quarters above. "The music box is in my father's sitting room," she whispered as Harrison worked on the lock. "On the mantelpiece." The lock yielded quickly and they entered the darkened stairwell. Eleanor led the way up, moving with the confidence of someone returning home. The living quarters were modest but comfortable, a sitting room, small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Everything was exactly as it had been when Eleanor left the night after her father's burial. On the sitting room mantelpiece stood a wooden music box about the size of a small book. Elaborately carved with botanical motifs, it featured a small decorative keyhole on the front panel separate from the winding mechanism underneath. Eleanor took the brass key from Harrison with trembling fingers. It fit perfectly into the keyhole, turning with a soft click. The front panel of the music box swung open, revealing not the expected musical mechanism, but a hidden compartment containing a small leather portfolio. "This is it," Eleanor breathed, carefully removing the portfolio. "Father's final proof." They had no time to examine the contents there. Quickly relocking the music box and leaving everything else undisturbed, they made their way back down the stairs and into the alley behind the apothecary. The night had grown colder, a gusty wind sending leaves skittering along the boardwalks as they hurried back to the hotel. Safe in Eleanor's room, they spread the contents of the portfolio on the small writing desk. Inside were several documents, land deeds, maps with annotations, and letters bearing the territorial governor's seal. Most significantly, there was a ledger detailing payments between Blackwood Governor Blair and several other territorial officials. "This is incredible," Eleanor said, examining the ledger. "Direct evidence of bribes paid for fraudulent land transactions, signatures, dates, amounts." Harrison studied one of the maps. "These markings show Paiute treaty lands that were reclassified and sold to private interests." His finger traced a particular section, "including parts of what is now my ranch." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Your land was part of their scheme." "Apparently so, though I purchased it legally from the previous owner." Harrison's expression darkened, "which explains Blackwood's interest in driving me out over the years. My property controls access to the Northern Valley watershed." As they continued examining the documents, a particular letter caught Eleanor's attention. It was from her father to Marshal Hollister, dated 1 week before Thomas Sullivan's death. The letter detailed the evidence compiled against Blair and Blackwood, but more importantly, it revealed the full scope of their conspiracy. "It wasn't just about land," Eleanor said, her voice hollow with shock. "They were planning to forcibly relocate the entire Paiute tribe to a reservation in Nevada against the terms of their treaty." Harrison took the letter, reading it with growing anger. They needed control of the water rights and transportation routes before initiating the removal. He looked up. "According to this, they're planning to begin the forced relocation immediately after the governor's official visit, which is now." Eleanor realized the implications with growing horror. Within days, the sound of boots on the hotel stairs interrupted their discovery. Heavy footsteps approached, stopping outside Eleanor's door. Harrison immediately gathered the documents, thrusting them into Eleanor's hands. "Hide these," he whispered urgently. "Use the connecting door. Go to my room." As Eleanor hurried to comply, a loud knock rattled the door. "Miss Sullivan, this is Deputy Clark. Open up, please." Harrison waited until Eleanor had secured the connecting door before answering. He opened the door to find the deputy and 2 of Blackwood's men standing in the hallway. "Can I help you, Deputy?" Harrison asked calmly. "Colonel Harrison?" The deputy looked surprised, then uncomfortable. "I'm looking for Miss Sullivan. Governor Blair requests her presence immediately at the courthouse. Official business." "At this hour, the reception must be nearly over." "These are my orders, sir." The deputy glanced at Blackwood's men, who stood like sentinels behind him. The governor was most insistent. Harrison sized up the situation quickly. 3 men in the hallway, possibly more waiting below. A confrontation now would be dangerous and might expose the documents they'd just recovered. "Miss Sullivan retired early," he said. "The day's activities exhausted her. Please convey her apologies to the governor and assure him she'll call upon him tomorrow as arranged." The deputy hesitated, clearly torn between completing his assignment and challenging a man of Harrison's reputation. One of Blackwood's men stepped forward. "Our instructions were to escort the lady to the courthouse," he said, his hand resting suggestively near his holstered weapon. "Not to return without her." Harrison's posture shifted subtly, his own hand moving closer to his concealed revolver. "The lady is resting. I won't disturb her for anything less than an emergency." Tension crackled in the narrow hallway. The deputy, sensing the potential for violence, raised his hands placatingly. "Perhaps a compromise. If Miss Sullivan is truly resting, we'll return in the morning first thing." He glanced nervously between Harrison and Blackwood's men. "The governor's business can wait that long, I'm sure." After a moment of silent standoff, Blackwood's men reluctantly backed down. "Morning then," one growled, "but we'll be watching the hotel all night." After they departed, Harrison quickly locked the door and moved to the connecting door. Eleanor stood just inside his room, the portfolio clutched to her chest, her face pale with tension. "They know," she whispered. "They know we have the documents." "Not for certain," Harrison countered, "but they suspect. Someone must have seen us enter or leave the apothecary." He took the portfolio from her, securing it inside his saddlebag. "We can't stay here. They'll return with more men or a more official order." "Where can we go?" "They'll be watching all the exits." Harrison checked his revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded. "There's only one safe place now. We need to reach Wolf Shadow and the Paiute settlement. Their land is outside territorial jurisdiction." "That's at least 15 miles from here," Eleanor protested, "and they'll be watching the livery stable for our horses." "We won't take the main road." Harrison began gathering their essential belongings. "There's a back way out of town through the creek bed. It adds distance but provides cover." Eleanor moved to assist him, her actions quick and decisive despite her fear. "How soon can we leave?" "As soon as you're ready. We'll go out through my window. There's a roof below that leads to the alley behind the hotel." As Eleanor returned to her room to collect her few possessions, including her father's journal, Harrison stared out at the darkened town. The peaceful isolation he had cultivated for years had been irrevocably shattered. Ahead lay conflict, danger, and the resurrection of ghosts he'd tried to bury. Yet despite the peril, he felt more alive than he had in years. The empty numbness that had plagued him since Chancellorsville had been replaced by purpose, and by something else he scarcely dared acknowledge. Something that flickered to life whenever Eleanor's determined green eyes met his. 20 minutes later, they slipped through Harrison's window onto the sloping roof below, the evidence of corruption and murder secured in their possession, and the long journey to the Paiute settlement ahead of them. The night was moonless, clouds obscuring the stars and promising rain. Harrison led the way, moving with the stealth of a man accustomed to wilderness travel. They kept to the shadows, avoiding the few oil lamps that illuminated Eagle Ridge's main street, and made their way to the creek that ran behind the town. "The creek bed leads north for about 5 miles, Harrison whispered as they descended the muddy bank. "Then we'll need to head east through the forest. It's rough country, but Blackwood's men won't expect us to go that way." Eleanor nodded, pulling her shawl tighter against the growing chill. The water in the creek was low, allowing them to walk along its rocky bed without getting wet. Still, the going was difficult, especially for Eleanor, whose healing back protested each uneven step. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour, putting distance between themselves and the town. The only sounds were the gentle gurgle of the creek, the occasional call of a night bird, and their own careful footsteps on the smooth stones. When they reached a small clearing where the creek widened into a shallow pool, Harrison called a halt. "We'll rest here for a few minutes. How are you holding up?" Eleanor sank gratefully onto a fallen log. "I'll manage. I've marched with armies before." Harrison smiled faintly in the darkness. "I believe you would have." As they rested, a distant rumble of thunder warned of the approaching storm. Harrison looked up at the cloudy sky with concern. "We need to make better time. The storm will wash away our tracks, but it will also make the creek dangerous. We should climb to higher ground before the rain starts." They continued their journey, leaving the creek bed to ascend a wooded hillside. The terrain grew steeper, forcing them to stop more frequently. During one such pause, Eleanor suddenly clutched Harrison's arm. "Listen," she whispered. From somewhere behind them came the faint sound of men's voices in the crack of branches, the unmistakable sounds of pursuit. How did they find us so quickly? Eleanor gasped. They must have been watching all possible exits from town. Harrison's voice was grim. We need to move faster. They pushed on through the darkness, no longer concerned with stealth, focused only on speed. The voices grew fainter, but Harrison knew their pursuers wouldn't give up easily. Blackwood had too much at stake. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as they crested a ridge overlooking a valley. Below, a river snaked through the landscape, its outline barely visible in the darkness. That's the North Fork, Harrison said, gesturing toward the river. The Paiute settlement is about 10 miles beyond it. We need to cross before the storm swells the water. They descended toward the river, slipping on the increasingly muddy ground as the rain intensified. By the time they reached the bank, the storm had fully arrived, sheets of rain reducing visibility to mere yards. The river, already swollen from spring runoff, churned darkly before them. What might have been a manageable ford in dry weather now presented a dangerous obstacle. "We can't cross here," Eleanor shouted over the storm. "It's too deep, too fast." Harrison scanned the bank looking for alternatives. "There's a fallen tree about 50 yards downstream. We might be able to cross on that." They made their way along the riverbank, the rain plastering their clothes to their bodies, the wind driving the cold deep into their bones. The fallen tree, a massive pine, stretched across the river, its trunk still solid despite its time in the elements. "I'll go first," Harrison said, stepping onto the log. "Test its stability." Carefully, he made his way across the rain-slick bark, treacherous underfoot. When he reached the far side, he waved for Eleanor to follow. "Take it slowly," he called. "Use your hands for balance." Eleanor began her crossing, moving with deliberate care. Halfway across, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The sudden light revealed what the darkness had hidden, 3 riders emerging from the forest behind them. "Harrison!" one of the men shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Stop right there." "Keep moving," Harrison called to Eleanor, drawing his revolver. "Don't look back." Eleanor continued her precarious journey across the log as Harrison fired a warning shot in the direction of their pursuers. The men dismounted, taking cover behind trees at the river's edge. Just as Eleanor was about to reach the far side, another lightning flash revealed one of Blackwood's men raising a rifle. Harrison fired again, forcing the man to duck, but the distraction was costly. Eleanor slipped on the wet bark, losing her balance and plunging into the churning river below. "Eleanor!" Harrison shouted, diving in after her without hesitation. The current immediately seized them both, the frigid water stealing their breath as it carried them downstream. Eleanor fought against the pull, but the weight of her sodden clothing dragged her under. Just as darkness began to close in around her vision, strong hands grabbed her, pulling her to the surface. Harrison held her against him with one arm, using the other to swim toward the shore. The current fought them, sweeping them further downstream, but Harrison's powerful strokes gradually brought them closer to the bank. Behind them, gunshots rang out, bullets striking the water nearby. Their pursuers were following along the bank, using the lightning flashes to target them in the dark water. With a final surge of effort, Harrison reached a low-hanging branch extending from the shore. He grabbed it, anchoring them against the current, then helped Eleanor climb onto the bank. He followed, collapsing beside her on the muddy ground as bullets thudded into trees around them. "Can you run?" he gasped. Eleanor nodded, too breathless to speak. They stumbled to their feet and plunged into the forest on the far side of the river, using the storm's fury as cover. The dense trees quickly swallowed them, hiding them from their pursuers, who would now have to find their own way across the swollen river. They ran until their legs gave out, finally taking shelter beneath the spreading branches of a massive pine where the ground remained relatively dry. Both were soaked to the skin, shivering uncontrollably in the cold night air. "The saddlebag," Eleanor suddenly remembered. "The documents, are they?" Harrison patted the bag, still miraculously secured across his chest. "Oilskin wrapped. They should be dry." Relief washed over Eleanor's face, followed quickly by concern. "You're bleeding." Harrison touched his temple, his fingers coming away red. "Must have hit a rock in the river. It's nothing." "Let me see." Eleanor moved closer, examining the gash in the intermittent flashes of lightning. "It needs cleaning, but it's not deep." She tore a strip from her petticoat, still relatively dry beneath her outer clothes, and bound the wound as best she could in the darkness. "Thank you," Harrison said, catching her hand as she finished. "For a moment there in the river, I thought—" "I know." Eleanor's voice was soft. You saved my life." Their eyes met in the darkness, a current passing between them that had nothing to do with the river they'd just escaped. For a heartbeat, the storm their pursuers, the danger, all of it receded, leaving only the two of them connected by something neither dared to name. The moment was broken by a distant shout carried on the wind. Their pursuers had found a way across the river and were continuing the chase. "We need to keep moving," Harrison said, helping Eleanor to her feet. "The Paiute settlement is still several miles away." "I can make it," Eleanor assured him, though exhaustion was evident in every line of her body. They pressed on through the storm, the night seeming to stretch endlessly before them. The rain eventually slackened, though the wind continued to moan through the trees, carrying with it the occasional distant shout of their pursuers, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there, a constant reminder of the danger at their backs. Dawn was breaking, a faint grayness seeping into the eastern sky, when they finally glimpsed smoke rising from the valley ahead, the cooking fires of the Paiute settlement. "We made it," Eleanor breathed, swaying with exhaustion. Harrison steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "Not quite yet. We still need to reach the settlement before Blackwood's men catch up." They had just started down the slope toward the valley when the crack of a rifle split the morning air. A bullet whined past them, thudding into a tree trunk. "Run!" Harrison ordered, pushing Eleanor ahead of him as he turned to return fire. They sprinted down the hillside, slipping and sliding on the rain-soaked ground. Behind them, more shots rang out, their pursuers closing the distance. Ahead, the Paiute settlement stirred to life, alerted by the gunfire. Several warriors emerged from their lodges, weapons in hand. Wolf Shadow was among them, immediately recognizing the situation. He shouted orders in the Paiute language, and warriors fanned out, taking defensive positions around the perimeter of the settlement. As Harrison and Eleanor stumbled into the clearing, before the first lodges, Wolf Shadow and two younger men moved to cover their retreat, firing at the tree line where Blackwood's men had taken position. "Inside," Wolf Shadow commanded, gesturing toward a large lodge at the center of the settlement. "Thundering Bear waits." They ducked into the lodge, breathing hard from their flight. Inside, an elderly man sat by a small fire, his deeply lined face impassive beneath a shock of white hair. Though he must have been well into his 70s, he sat straight-backed and alert, his dark eyes missing nothing. "Thundering Bear," Harrison said respectfully. "We seek sanctuary." The old man nodded once. "The daughter of Sullivan is welcome, as is friend Harrison." His English was slow but precise. "You bring trouble to our door." "Not by choice," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "Men who killed my father now hunt us. We carry proof of their crimes against your people." Thundering Bear gestured for them to sit. "Show this proof." Harrison removed the portfolio from his saddlebag, carefully unwrapping the oilskin to reveal the documents, miraculously still dry despite their river plunge. Eleanor spread them before the Paiute elder, explaining the evidence of land fraud and the plan to relocate the tribe forcibly. Thundering Bear examined the documents with keen eyes that belied his age. "These are the papers your father spoke of," he said to Eleanor. "He came to warn us 4 moons past, said bad men in government planned to take our lands against treaty." "You believed him?" Harrison asked. "Thomas Sullivan never spoke with forked tongue," the old man replied simply. "He healed our people when others would not, taught our healers his medicine." He looked at Eleanor. "He spoke often of daughter with healing hands and fierce heart." Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes at this unexpected connection to her father, this evidence that he had spoken of her with pride to his friends among the Paiute. "These documents must reach federal authorities," Harrison said, bringing the discussion back to their immediate concern. "Marshal Hollister was reassigned after receiving earlier evidence from Thomas. We need to find another official who can't be influenced by Blair." Thundering Bear considered this. "I have contact with Indian agent in Helena, man named Richardson, honest for white government man." He pointed to a young warrior who had been sitting quietly near the lodge entrance. "Swift Horse can ride to Helena tonight. 20 miles. Return with Richardson in 2 days." Harrison nodded. "That would be best. Blackwood's men will be watching all the regular routes. They won't expect a Paiute messenger." "What of you?" Thundering Bear asked. "Blackwood will not stop hunting. He knows you are here." "He suspects but isn't certain," Harrison replied. "The storm in the forest covered our tracks. We should be safe until Richardson arrives." Thundering Bear's expression suggested he wasn't convinced. "Blackwood has many men. Some were Confederate scouts during war." Good trackers. He glanced at Eleanor. And woman is injured. Cannot run if attacked. We'll defend the settlement if necessary, Harrison said firmly. No. Thundering Bear shook his head. Too many women, children. If Blackwood brings many men, blood will flow. He was silent for a moment, thinking. There is another place. Old cave in cliff wall. Our sacred place. Few know of it. You hide there until Richardson comes. Eleanor and Harrison exchanged glances. Would your people allow outsiders in a sacred place? She asked. For daughter of Thomas Sullivan and friend of Paiute, Thundering Bear's weathered face creased in a slight smile. Yes, spirits will understand necessity. It was decided. Swift Horse would depart immediately for Helena with copies of the most damning documents, while the originals would remain with Eleanor and Harrison. At dawn the next day, Wolf Shadow himself would guide them to the cave hideaway, where they would wait for Richardson's arrival. As night fell over the settlement, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She sat outside Thundering Bear's lodge, wrapped in a warm Paiute blanket, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The settlement had grown quiet, with only the occasional cry of a child or murmur of conversation breaking the stillness. Soft footsteps announced Harrison's approach before he spoke. You should be resting, he said, settling beside her on the ground. My mind won't quiet, she admitted. Every time I close my eyes, I see Blackwood's face as he pursued us across that ravine, the hatred in his eyes. He's desperate. Men like Blackwood and Blair have built their power on the belief that they're untouchable. Your father's evidence threatens everything they've worked for. Eleanor nodded, drawing the blanket closer around her shoulders. I keep thinking about Father, whether he knew what would happen when he began investigating, whether he was afraid. He must have been, Harrison said quietly. Only a fool wouldn't be afraid facing such powerful enemies. But he did it anyway. That's true courage. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the night sounds of the forest surrounding them, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through pine boughs, the distant howl of a wolf. I've been thinking about Chancellorsville, Eleanor said suddenly, about Michael and those 23 men. Harrison tensed beside her, but she continued before he could speak. I've held on to my anger for so long, blamed you for a decision made in circumstances I can barely imagine. She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. But these past days have shown me the weight of such choices, the responsibility of deciding between terrible options when lives hang in the balance. Eleanor, he began, but she placed her hand gently on his arm. I forgive you, James, for Michael, for the choice you had to make. Her voice was steady, though tears glistened in her eyes. And I thank you for remembering him all these years, for carrying his memory when I was too hurt to honor it properly. The simple words struck Harrison with the force of physical blows. For 11 years he had carried the weight of those deaths, the faces of those men appearing in his dreams, their names a litany he recited in private penance. Never had he expected forgiveness, least of all from the sister of the man who had led that doomed mission. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said roughly. It's not about deserving, Eleanor replied. It's about letting go of the past so we can face what's coming. She hesitated, then added softly, Michael would want that for both of us. Before Harrison could respond, a commotion arose from the edge of the settlement. A sentry was calling out in the Paiute language, his voice urgent. Thundering Bear emerged from his lodge, listening intently before turning to them. Riders approaching, he said grimly. Many, from south. Harrison was on his feet instantly. Blackwood. How many? Sentry counts 12, maybe more. 12, Eleanor gasped. That's not just Blackwood's men. That's the territorial militia, Harrison finished. Blair has called out official forces. Thundering Bear's expression hardened. They cannot enter Paiute land without breaking treaty. Treaties haven't stopped them before, Harrison said bitterly. Thundering Bear, get your people ready to defend themselves, but don't fire first. Eleanor and I will leave immediately for the cave. If they're focused on finding us, they may leave the settlement alone. Too late, Thundering Bear replied, pointing to the torches now visible approaching through the trees. They arrive soon. No time to reach cave. Harrison made a swift decision. Then we stand with you. Where are the documents? Here. Eleanor produced the portfolio from within her blanket where she had kept it close. Hide them, Harrison instructed. Somewhere they won't think to look, then both of you stay out of sight as much as possible. I'll speak with them first." As Eleanor hurried to conceal the portfolio, Harrison checked his weapons. The revolver was nearly empty after their earlier confrontation, but his rifle still had ammunition. Not enough to hold off 12 men, but perhaps enough to negotiate from a position of strength. The Paiute warriors had taken defensive positions around the perimeter of the settlement, armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and rifles acquired through trade. Women and children were being ushered into the lodges furthest from the approaching riders. Harrison took position beside Thundering Bear at the settlement's entrance, watching as the column of mounted men emerged from the tree line. Wesley Blackwood rode at the front alongside a man in the uniform of the territorial militia. Behind them came Blackwood's hired guns and several uniformed militiamen, all armed and grim-faced. "That's Captain Winters of the militia," Harrison murmured to Thundering Bear. "Blair's man through and through. What they want, they cannot have," Thundering Bear replied simply. The riders halted 20 yards from the settlement entrance. Blackwood spurred his horse forward a few paces. "Harrison," he called, "we know you're in there. You and the Sullivan woman. Come out now, and no one else needs to get hurt." Harrison stepped forward, rifle held ready, but not aimed. "This is Paiute land, Blackwood, protected by federal treaty. You have no authority here." Captain Winters urged his horse alongside Blackwood. "We have every authority, Harrison. Governor Blair has declared a state of emergency due to threats against territorial officials. We're here to arrest you and Eleanor Sullivan on charges of theft, trespassing, and sedition." "Fabricated charges," Harrison replied coolly, "to cover up the real crimes, land fraud, corruption, and the murder of Thomas Sullivan." Murmurs ran through the ranks of the militiamen at this accusation. Clearly not all had been fully informed of the situation. "Careful, Harrison," Blackwood warned. "Slander against the territorial governor is a serious offense. It's not slander when we have proof." Eleanor's voice rang out as she stepped from Thundering Bear's lodge to stand beside Harrison. Despite her bedraggled appearance, she carried herself with dignity and determination. Documents bearing the governor's signature detailing bribes and illegal land transactions. "Evidence my father died to protect." Blackwood's face darkened with anger. "Where are these alleged documents?" "Safe," Eleanor replied, "and copies are already on their way to federal authorities in Helena." This was a calculated risk. Swifthorse had indeed departed for Helena, but had only just begun his journey. Yet the claim might give Blackwood and Winters pause. "You're bluffing," Blackwood scoffed, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Eleanor held his gaze steadily. "My father sent evidence to Marshal Hollister before his death. That's why Hollister was so hastily reassigned to Wyoming. But he wasn't the only federal official my father contacted." Harrison admired her quick thinking, creating just enough doubt to make Blackwood hesitate. Captain Winters, less personally invested than Blackwood, seemed more cautious now. "Regardless of these allegations, we have orders to take you both into custody." "We refuse," Harrison stated flatly. "You're outnumbered, Captain. The Paiute warriors surrounding this settlement might not have your fancy uniforms, but they're expert marksmen. Start a fight here, and many of your men won't ride home." It was a dangerous bluff. While the Paiute warriors were indeed skilled, they were outnumbered by the combined force of militia and Blackwood's men. A pitched battle would result in devastating casualties on both sides and likely end with the territorial government using the incident as justification for even harsher measures against the tribe. Winters surveyed the settlement, noting the positioned warriors, then glanced at his own men. Several looked distinctly uncomfortable with the situation, having enlisted to maintain order in the territory, not to attack a peaceful native settlement on dubious grounds. Perhaps a compromise, the captain suggested, ignoring Blackwood's scowl. "Surrender the documents you claim to have, and we'll withdraw to discuss their contents with the governor. If your allegations have merit, appropriate action will be taken." "So you can destroy the evidence?" Eleanor shook her head. "We're not fools, Captain." The standoff continued, tension building with each passing moment. Harrison knew they were in an impossible situation. Even if they survived an initial confrontation, reinforcements would eventually arrive. The Paiute would suffer and the evidence might still be lost. Just as it seemed violence was inevitable, a commotion arose from the rear of the militia column. Riders were approaching from the east, a small group moving at speed toward the confrontation. As they drew closer, Harrison made out the distinctive uniform of federal marshals. "Federal agents," he murmured to Eleanor. "But how?" The newcomers rode directly up to Captain Winters, their leader, a stern-faced man in his 50s, producing official documentation. "Captain Winters, I'm Chief Marshal Benjamin Hollister," he announced in a carrying voice. "These men are under my jurisdiction now. Stand down your militia." Winters stared in shocked recognition. "Marshal Hollister, you were reassigned to Wyoming Territory." "Temporarily." Hollister's gaze swept over the assembled militia Blackwood's men and the Paiute defenders. "That reassignment has been rescinded in light of new evidence concerning corruption in the Montana territorial government." Blackwood's face had gone ashen. "What evidence? What are you talking about?" Hollister ignored him, focusing on Winters. "Captain, you have a choice. Withdraw your men now or face charges of obstruction of federal justice. Governor Blair is already in custody in Helena." A murmur of shock ran through the militiamen. Winters hesitated clearly, torn between his orders and the sudden appearance of federal authority. "He's bluffing," Blackwood hissed. "Blair can't be in custody. We just left him in Eagle Ridge yesterday." But Hollister produced a telegram. "This arrived in Helena this morning. Governor Edmund Blair was arrested in Eagle Ridge at dawn by federal agents from Bozeman. The charges include corruption, fraud, and conspiracy to murder." Eleanor stepped forward. "Marshal Hollister, I'm Eleanor Sullivan, Thomas Sullivan's daughter." Recognition flashed in the marshal's eyes. "Miss Sullivan, your father was a brave man. His initial evidence put us on Blair's trail, but it wasn't quite enough for an arrest. We've been building the case for months." "We have the rest of the evidence," she said. "My father's final proof detailed records of the land fraud scheme and plans to forcibly relocate the Paiute tribe." Hollister nodded grimly. "That would complete our case. I'd like to see those documents as soon as possible." Captain Winters, seeing the tide had turned, ordered his militia to stand down. Several of Blackwood's men, sensing their employer's imminent arrest, quietly slipped away during the confusion. Blackwood himself sat rigid in his saddle, hatred burning in his eyes as he stared at Harrison and Eleanor. "This isn't over," he growled. "Actually it is," Hollister replied, gesturing to two of his deputies. "Wesley Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy, land fraud, and accessory to murder." As the deputies moved to take Blackwood into custody, he suddenly spurred his horse, breaking through the circle of men. He drew his revolver, aiming directly at Eleanor. "You'll join your father," he shouted, squeezing the trigger. Several shots rang out simultaneously. Harrison had thrown himself in front of Eleanor, his rifle raised. Thundering Bear and his warriors had fired, as had Marshal Hollister and his deputies. Blackwood tumbled from his horse, multiple bullets having found their mark. He lay motionless in the dirt, his final act of vengeance thwarted by the very people he had sought to destroy. In the stunned silence that followed, Eleanor found herself trembling, supported by Harrison's steady arm around her waist. The violence had ended as suddenly as it had erupted, leaving in its wake a strange, hollow feeling, not triumph, but the exhausted relief that comes with surviving a terrible storm. "Are you hurt?" Harrison asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "No," she whispered. "You..." He shook his head, though a grimace suggested one of his old wounds had been aggravated by his sudden movement. Marshal Hollister approached them, holstering his weapon. "I apologize for cutting it so close. We've been tracking Blair and Blackwood for months, ever since Thomas Sullivan first contacted me. When he was killed, I knew we had to move carefully." "You were reassigned," Eleanor said, still trying to understand, "to Wyoming." "A ruse," Hollister explained. "My superiors in Washington arranged it to make Blair believe he was safe while we continued gathering evidence. I never stopped working the case." He smiled slightly. "Your father was a good man, Miss Sullivan. He believed in justice above all else." "As did his son," Harrison added quietly, meeting Eleanor's gaze. As the morning sun rose higher over the Paiute settlement, casting long shadows across the scene of the confrontation, Eleanor felt something shift within her, a burden lifting, a chapter closing. The men who had murdered her father would face justice. The threat to the Paiute had been averted, and she had found in the most unlikely of places a connection to her brother's memory that brought healing rather than pain. She looked up at Harrison, whose arms still supported her, and saw in his gray eyes a similar recognition that they had both in their own ways begun to emerge from the shadows of the past into the uncertain but promising light of a new day. In the days that followed Blackwood's death, the Paiute settlement became a center of activity. Marshal Hollister established a temporary headquarters in one of the larger lodges where he and his deputies sorted through the evidence Eleanor and Harrison had recovered. Swifthorse returned from Helena with the Indian agent Richardson, a solemn, bespectacled man who meticulously documented the treaty violations and prepared reports for Washington. For Eleanor, the aftermath brought a strange mixture of relief and grief. Justice for her father was within reach, yet his absence felt more acute than ever. Each document they reviewed, each piece of evidence they cataloged, bore the imprint of Thomas Sullivan's methodical mind and unwavering principles. He knew the risks, Harrison said quietly one evening, finding Eleanor sitting alone outside Thundering Bear's lodge staring at the stars. Your father understood what he was confronting. I know, Bao, she replied, making room for him on the log bench. That's what makes it both better and worse. He chose this path knowing where it might lead. Harrison settled beside her, his shoulder a whisper away from hers. Like Michael at Chancellorsville. Yes, Eleanor's voice softened. The Sullivan family seems drawn to lost causes and principles worth dying for. Not lost, Harrison corrected gently. Your father's cause wasn't lost. Neither was Michael's. That's the difference between sacrifice and tragedy, whether it serves a purpose greater than oneself. Eleanor considered this, drawing comfort from the idea. Marshal Hollister says the evidence is overwhelming. Governor Blair is facing federal charges, along with 3 territorial judges and the land commissioner. Good, Harrison's voice held a cold satisfaction. Men who abuse power deserve to lose it. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as shooting stars occasionally streaked across the vast Montana sky. Around them, the Paiute settlement breathed with quiet life, murmured conversations from nearby lodges, the soft laughter of children being put to bed, the distant singing of an old woman to her grandchild. What will you do now? Harrison finally asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them for days. Eleanor took a deep breath, considering. I'm not sure. I could return to Chicago to nursing. The hospital would take me back. She paused. Or I could stay, reopen the apothecary. There's still good to be done here. Eagle Ridge might not be the most welcoming place after all this. Perhaps not at first, she acknowledged, but time changes people's memories, their allegiances. And there are good people there too, De Winters, Jimmy Reeves and his friends. People who respected my father. Harrison nodded, his face thoughtful in the starlight. And what about you, Eleanor asked. Will you return to your solitude? I've lived with ghosts for too long, he said, quietly echoing words he'd spoken days before. 23 men whose faces I see each night, your brother Michael among them. And now, Eleanor prompted when he fell silent. Harrison turned to her, his gray eyes reflecting the golden light of the settlement's fires. Now I see the living. I see you, Eleanor Sullivan. And for the first time in 11 years, the past doesn't outweigh the present. She felt her heart quicken at his words, at the tentative hope in his voice. Is that enough to build a future on? It's a beginning, he replied, his hand finding hers. The land teaches patience. Growth takes time, especially after harsh seasons. Eleanor smiled, twining her fingers with his. My father would have liked that metaphor. He always said healing can't be rushed. Wise man Thomas Sullivan. Yes, she agreed softly. And I think he and Michael would approve of this, of us. Harrison didn't answer with words. Instead, he gently drew her closer, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. But Eleanor Sullivan, who had faced public whipping, pursued her father's killers, and helped expose a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of territorial government, knew exactly what she wanted. Their kiss was gentle, at first tentative, 2 people who had known too much loss testing the waters of newfound connection. But it deepened with the certainty that comes from shared struggle and mutual respect, a promise more binding than any spoken oath. When they finally drew apart, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky above. Harrison kept his arm around Eleanor's waist as they turned to walk back toward the settlement. It won't be easy, he said. There will be those who resent what we've done, who lost position or profit when Blair fell. I know nothing worthwhile is ever easy, Eleanor replied, but we're not alone in this. Thundering Bear and his people, Marshal Hollister, Dr. Winters, they stand with us. And we have each other, Harrison added softly. No small thing, that, Eleanor agreed, resting her head against his shoulder. As they reached Thundering Bear's lodge, where Eleanor had been given quarters, they found the old man sitting outside smoking a long pipe. His weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes held a knowing gleam as he observed their clasped hands. "The shadows leave your eyes," he said to Harrison. "Good. Too long they have lived there." Harrison nodded, accepting the observation with quiet dignity. "Tomorrow we feast," Thundering Bear continued, "to honor Sullivan's daughter and her warrior, to celebrate justice." "We're honored," Eleanor replied, "but I'm no warrior." The old man's face creased in a rare smile. "All who stand against evil are warriors, medicine woman. Some fight with guns, some with knowledge. Your father fought with truth. You fight with both." With that profound statement, he tapped out his pipe and rose, disappearing into his lodge with the fluid grace of a much younger man. Harrison and Eleanor exchanged a glance, both moved by the simple wisdom of the Paiute elder. In his eyes, they were already bound together by struggle, by purpose, and by something deeper that needed no name. "Until tomorrow, then," Harrison said softly, releasing her hand with reluctance. "Until tomorrow," Eleanor echoed, though they both knew their paths were now intertwined far beyond the next day's celebration. As she entered her small quarters in the lodge, Eleanor felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since receiving the telegram about her father's death. Justice had been served, but more importantly, she had found a way forward, not alone as she had expected, but alongside a man who understood both her pain and her strength. Outside, the Montana night deepened, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. The land endured as it always had, indifferent to the small dramas of human existence, yet somehow bearing witness to them all. And somewhere in that vastness, Eleanor thought Michael and her father would be pleased by the unexpected turns of fate that had brought healing where once there had been only wounds. The celebration began at midday, the entire Paiute settlement gathering in the central clearing, where long tables had been set up laden with food. Venison, rabbit, and fish roasted over open fires, their rich aromas mingling with the scent of pine smoke and wild sage. Eleanor wore a dress borrowed from one of the Paiute women, adorned with simple beadwork at the collar and cuffs. Her copper hair, freshly washed, hung loose down her back, catching the sunlight like burnished metal. Harrison, too, had made an effort, his dark hair neatly trimmed, wearing a clean shirt beneath his usual leather vest. They sat together at the place of honor beside Thundering Bear, with Marshal Hollister, Agent Richardson, and Wolf Shadow completing their table. The formality of the occasion was balanced by the genuine warmth of the celebration. Children ran laughing between the tables. Elders told stories to attentive listeners, and various members of the tribe performed traditional dances to the rhythm of drums and flutes. "I've never seen anything like this," Hollister admitted, watching the dancers with appreciation. "In 15 years as a federal marshal, I've visited dozens of settlements, but never been welcomed like this." "The Paiute honor those who stand with them," Wolf Shadow explained. "You bring justice. This is worthy of celebration." "We couldn't have done it without Miss Sullivan and Colonel Harrison," Hollister said, raising his cup in their direction. "Thomas Sullivan began the work, but you completed it." Eleanor smiled, accepting the toast with a slight bow of her head. "My father would be pleased to know his efforts weren't in vain." "They most certainly were not," Agent Richardson interjected. "The evidence you provided has already led to a review of all land transactions in the territory over the past 3 years. Several corrupt officials have been removed from office, and the treaty lands will be formally restored to the Paiute next month." "And Governor Blair?" Harrison asked. "Facing trial in Helena," Hollister replied. "The federal prosecutor believes he'll receive at least 20 years for his crimes." Harrison nodded, satisfied. "And Blackwood's men? Those we captured are being held for trial as accessories," the marshal said. "A few escaped, but they won't get far. We've circulated their descriptions to every lawman in the territory." As the conversation continued, Eleanor felt a deep sense of completion. The conspiracy that had claimed her father's life had been exposed, the guilty would face justice, and the Paiute would retain their ancestral lands. It was more than she had dared hope for when she first returned to Eagle Ridge. The afternoon progressed with more food, music, and storytelling. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Thundering Bear rose from his place, raising his hands for silence. The gathered tribe fell quiet, all their eyes turning toward their elder. "Today we honor friends of the Paiute," Thundering Bear began, his deep voice carrying across the clearing. "Woman who heals, daughter of Thomas Sullivan, who brought us truth," he gestured to Eleanor. "And war chief who seeks peace," he continued, indicating Harrison. "Together they face danger to protect our land, our people. He beckoned them both to stand, which they did somewhat self-consciously under the collective gaze of the tribe. The Sullivan man saved many Paiute lives with his healing knowledge. Thundering Bear continued. His daughter carries his spirit, his courage. The Harrison man fought his own shadows to stand in the light. Together they have restored balance. From behind him, Naomi Falling Water appeared carrying two intricately beaded leather bands. Thundering Bear took them, presenting one each to Eleanor and Harrison. The Paiute give these as symbols of brotherhood, sisterhood. You are family now to our people. Your children will be our children, your home, our home. Eleanor accepted the band with deep gratitude, recognizing the honor being bestowed. She slipped it onto her wrist, the soft leather settling against her skin like a promise. Beside her, Harrison did the same, his expression solemn yet touched. We are honored beyond words, Eleanor said, her voice clear in the hushed clearing. My father respected your people greatly. He would be humbled by this recognition. The Paiute and the white settlers need not be enemies, Harrison added. There is room in this land for all who respect it and each other. I pledge that my ranch will always be a place where your people are welcome. Thundering Bear nodded, satisfied with their responses. Now, he said, his voice lightening, we feast more and dance under stars. The celebration resumed with renewed vigor, the formal ceremony giving way to more relaxed festivities. As darkness fell, bonfires were lit around the clearing, their golden light creating a warm circle against the gathering night. Harrison led Eleanor away from the main gathering to a quiet spot at the edge of the firelight. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small object that caught the firelight, Michael's photograph, the one he had carried since Chancellorsville. This belongs to you now, he said softly, placing it in her palm. I've carried it long enough. Eleanor looked down at the image of her younger self preserved in time. Keep it, she said, closing his fingers back around the photograph. It's part of your journey, too. Besides, she added with a gentle smile, you'll have the real thing now. Harrison's eyes held hers, emotion making his voice rough. Are you certain Chicago has more to offer than a frontier ranch and a man with too many regrets? I've never been more certain of anything, Eleanor replied. Chicago will always be there. But what we found here, this is rare. Harrison drew her close, his arms encircling her with a protective tenderness that spoke of both strength and vulnerability. Then I make you this promise, Eleanor Sullivan. Whatever comes, whatever challenges we face, you won't face them alone. Nor will you, she whispered against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Around them, the celebration continued, music, laughter, and dancing, creating a tapestry of life and joy. But in their quiet corner, Eleanor and Harrison had created something equally precious, a moment of perfect understanding, a foundation upon which to build whatever came next. The future, with all its uncertainties, held no terror now. They would face it together, each stronger for having found the other, each more complete than they had been alone. The morning after the celebration dawned clear and cool, a hint of autumn in the air despite the summer season. Eleanor woke early, her mind already busy with plans for the day ahead. Marshal Hollister had arranged for a wagon to take them back to Eagle Ridge, where she would need to sort through her father's affairs and decide what to do with the apothecary. As she dressed, a soft knock sounded at the flap of her small sleeping quarters. Eleanor. It was Naomi Falling Water's voice. May I enter? Of course, Eleanor replied, fastening the last button on her borrowed dress. The elderly Paiute woman slipped inside carrying a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Before you leave, I bring something. From your father. Eleanor's heart quickened. From my father, but how? He give to me before his spirit journey, Naomi explained, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a small leather notebook, much worn around the edges. Say give to daughter when she ready to understand. With trembling hands, Eleanor accepted the notebook. Did he tell you what it contained? Naomi shook her head. Not for me to know. For Sullivan, daughter only. After the old woman had gone, Eleanor sat on her sleeping pallet, turning the notebook over in her hands. It was different from her father's medical journals, smaller, more personal. She opened it carefully, recognizing her father's neat handwriting immediately. The first entry was dated nearly 20 years earlier, when Eleanor was just a child, April 12, 1854. Today, I met a woman unlike any other. Sarah Lakota came to my clinic with her young son, ill with fever. She is Paiute, though she has lived among whites since marrying a trader who later abandoned her. Her knowledge of healing herbs surpasses my own medical training in many ways. I find myself eager to learn from her, though society would frown upon a white doctor taking instruction from a native woman. Eleanor's breath caught. She had never heard this name before, had no knowledge of her father's acquaintance with a Paiute woman. She read on fascination, growing with each entry. June 30th, 1854. Sarah has become my assistant in the clinic. The arrangement raises eyebrows, but I care not for gossip. Her son James plays with Eleanor when she visits the clinic. They are nearly the same age and get along wonderfully, oblivious to the social boundaries adults have constructed. December 18th, 1854. Sarah and I can no longer deny what has grown between us. I have asked her to marry me, knowing full well the scandal it will cause. She has accepted, but we must be careful. For Eleanor's sake, for James's sake, we must keep our relationship private for now. Eleanor turned page after page, heart pounding, as a history she had never known unfolded before her. Her father had fallen in love with a Paiute woman, had planned to marry her, had welcomed her son into their small family. Then came an entry that made her blood run cold. February 3rd, 1855. Disaster. Edmund Blair discovered our secret. He threatens to expose Sarah's presence in my home, to have her son taken from her and placed in a government school. He claims it is for my own good to preserve my reputation, but I see the truth in his eyes. He has always resented my success, my standing in the community. This is his way of controlling me, of ensuring my cooperation in his business ventures. I cannot risk Sarah and James's safety. They must leave. Eleanor's hands shook as she continued reading. The story grew darker. Her father forced into a business partnership with Blair, coerced into silence about questionable dealings, all to protect Sarah Lakota and her son, who had been sent to live with relatives in the Paiute settlement. May 17th, 1855. News that breaks my heart. Sarah has died of fever in the Paiute camp. Her son survives, taken in by her cousin. I wanted to bring him to live with us to raise him alongside Eleanor, but Blair's threats make this impossible. I must content myself with sending funds for his care through trusted intermediaries. Perhaps someday, when Eleanor is grown and Blair's influence has waned, I can acknowledge him properly. The entries grew more sporadic after that brief updates about the boy. James mentions of money sent, reports received about his progress. Then nearly a decade later, April 4th, 1863, word from the battlefield. James Lakota, who now goes by his father's surname, has distinguished himself in the Union Army. A lieutenant already, despite his youth and mixed heritage. I feel both pride and sorrow, pride in the man he has become. Sorrow that I could not claim him as my own. Eleanor gasped, the notebook nearly slipping from her fingers. Could it be? She flipped forward, frantically searching for confirmation of her suspicion. Several pages later, she found it, June 18, 1863. Devastating news from Virginia. Lieutenant Michael Lakota, my son, though I never had the courage to claim him publicly, was killed at Chancellorsville. He died leading a special mission, saving his regiment through his sacrifice. His commanding officer, a Colonel Harrison, wrote a letter of extraordinary compassion. Eleanor's brother, my son, gone without ever knowing the truth of his parentage. My grief is beyond words. The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor as the truth crashed over her. Michael, Lieutenant Michael Sullivan, as she had known him, was not her blood brother, but her stepbrother, her father's son, with Sarah Lakota. A son he had been forced to deny publicly, but had supported in secret. And Harrison, James Harrison, had been Michael's commanding officer, had written to her father about Michael's death, never knowing the true relationship between them. Eleanor read on, hands shaking, as her father detailed his growing suspicions about Blair's land dealings after the war, his decision to move to Montana Territory partly to be closer to Michael's Paiute relatives, his eventual discovery of Blair's corruption and determination to expose it despite the personal risk. The final entry, dated just days before his death, held a warning. March 12, 1874. Blair suspects I know too much. Blackwood watches the apothecary daily. I have sent evidence to Marshal Hollister, but fear it may not be enough. If anything happens to me, Eleanor must be protected. She knows nothing of her brother's true parentage or my connection to the Paiute. Blair would use such knowledge against her as he used it against me all these years. I pray she never needs to discover this history, but have left this journal with Naomi should the worst occur. May my daughter forgive me, my silence, my cowardice, in not acknowledging Michael properly. Everything I did was to protect them both, though I fear I have failed them in the end. Eleanor closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. The pieces fit together now. Her father's knowledge of Paiute medicine, his special relationship with the tribe, Thundering Bear's immediate acceptance of her. Even her own inexplicable connection to Harrison made a new kind of sense, as if Michael had somehow led them to each other across the divide of death. She sat motionless, absorbing the implications of what she had learned. Her father had carried this secret his entire adult life, had lost not only his love, but his son had been blackmailed and ultimately killed because of Blair's knowledge of his relationship with a Paiute woman. And Michael Brave kind. Michael had died never knowing his true heritage, never understanding why Thomas Sullivan took such special interest in his military career, sending him packages and letters throughout the war. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor, the wagon is ready whenever you are. It was Harrison standing respectfully outside her quarters. James, she called, her voice unsteady. Could you come in, please? He entered, concern immediately evident on his face when he saw her tears. What's happened? Are you all right? Wordlessly, she held out the journal. Naomi just brought me this. It was my father's personal diary. I think you should read it. Harrison took the small book, settling beside her on the pallet. She watched his face as he read, saw the shocked confusion, and finally understanding dawn in his eyes. Michael was your father's son, he said, finally looking up from the pages. With a Paiute woman? Yeah, Eleanor whispered. My stepbrother, though I never knew it. And Blair used that knowledge to control my father for years. Harrison's expression darkened. The bigotry, the fear of scandal, Blair weaponized it against a good man. He shook his head in disgust. Your father protected Michael the only way he could, by keeping his distance. And Michael never knew, Eleanor said, fresh tears welling. He died thinking his father was a traitor who abandoned him and his mother. Harrison took her hand gently. Michael knew he was loved. He spoke often of the doctor who had taken an interest in him, who sent him books and supplies when others in his unit received nothing. He may not have known the exact relationship, but he felt the connection. Did he ever mention his Paiute heritage to you? Eleanor asked. No, Harrison admitted, but it explains certain things, his knowledge of tracking, his ability to move silently through forests that confounded other men. I just assumed he was a naturally gifted soldier. Eleanor stood abruptly, needing to move to process. All these years I've thought of Michael as my brother, and he was in every way that matters. But to learn that my father had this whole other life, this love he was forced to abandon because of prejudice and Blair's threats, it doesn't change who your father was, Harrison said gently. If anything, it shows his capacity for love, his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness for those he cared about. Eleanor nodded slowly, beginning to see beyond her initial shock. You're right, and it explains his connection to the Paiute, his determination to protect their land rights. She looked at Harrison with sudden clarity. He was fighting for Michael's people, his son's heritage. A heritage that's part of you now, Harrison observed. Not by blood, but by choice, by honoring your father's commitment to justice. Eleanor felt a weight lifting as she absorbed this perspective. The revelation, shocking as it was, didn't diminish her father's memory. It enriched it, showing dimensions of courage and love she had never fully understood. I need to tell Thundering Bear, she said decisively. He probably knows some of this already, but he should hear the full story from me. Harrison rose, returning the journal to her hands. Would you like me to come with you? Please, she said, grateful for his steady presence. They found Thundering Bear at the edge of the settlement, watching the younger men practice with bows. The old man listened without interruption as Eleanor shared what she had learned, his weathered face revealing nothing until she had finished. This explains much, he said finally. Thomas Sullivan's knowledge of our ways, his concern for our land. And you, he added, looking at Eleanor with new understanding, your connection to our people felt through your heart even before your mind knew. Did you know, Eleanor asked, about Michael, about my father's relationship with Sarah Lakota? Thundering Bear nodded slowly. Not all details, but old ones. Remembered Sarah, remembered Boy, taken to live with whites after her death. Your father visited in secret, brought medicines, gifts. His eyes grew distant with memory. Boy returned once as man before war. proud in blue uniform. This was Michael, your brother. Half-brother, Eleanor corrected gently. No such thing to Paiute, Thundering Bear replied with simple certainty. Brother is brother. Family is who stands beside you in darkness, not just who shares blood. The wisdom of his words resonated deeply with Eleanor. Hadn't she always thought of Michael as her brother? His parentage changed nothing about the bond they had shared. Michael's spirit guided you here, Thundering Bear continued, to find truth to complete Father's work. To meet this one, he added, gesturing to Harrison, circle closes as it should. Eleanor glanced at Harrison, seeing in his eyes the same sense of destiny, of pieces falling into place that defied simple coincidence. Michael had connected them first through the tragedy of Chancellorsville, and now through this revelation of shared heritage and purpose. What will you do with this knowledge? Thundering Bear asked. Eleanor considered the question carefully. Honor it, she finally said. Continue my father's work. Ensure that the Paiute lands remain protected. And perhaps, she added, looking again at Harrison, build something new that bridges our worlds as my father once dreamed of doing. Thundering Bear nodded approval, evident in his dark eyes. Good answer. Now, he said, rising with fluid grace despite his years, you journey back to Whitetown. Remember, Paiute Camp always open to Sullivan daughter and Harrison man. You family now. As they walked back toward the center of the settlement, where the wagon waited, Harrison took Eleanor's hand. Are you all right? He asked quietly. It's a lot to take in. I'm still processing, she admitted. But yes, I think I'm all right. Better than all right in some ways. I feel closer to my father now, understanding the burden he carried all those years. And Michael, Eleanor smiled softly, he's still my brother, always will be. And now I understand why he and I were so alike in some ways despite not sharing blood. We were both Thomas Sullivan's children, both raised with his sense of justice and compassion. Harrison squeezed her hand gently. He would be proud of you. Both of them would. As they reached the wagon, Marshal Hollister approached, papers in hand. Miss Sullivan, Colonel Harrison, I have the official documents transferring the Sullivan property back to your possession. The apothecary and all its contents are legally yours again. Thank you, Marshal, Eleanor said, accepting the papers, for everything you've done. Your father started this fight, Hollister replied. I'm just glad we could finish it properly. He glanced at the wagon. Are you certain you want to return to Eagle Ridge so soon? There might still be those loyal to Blackwood and Blair in town. We need to face it sometime, Harrison said. Better now with the territory still buzzing about Blair's arrest than to let fear take root. Besides, Eleanor added, I have decisions to make about the apothecary. It's been closed too long already. Hollister nodded, understanding. I'll be returning to Helena today, but I've assigned Deputy Morris to remain in Eagle Ridge for the next month, just as a precaution. If you have any trouble, any at all, he'll be at the sheriff's office. With final farewells to Thundering Bear, Naomi, and Wolf Shadow, Eleanor and Harrison climbed onto the wagon. As they pulled away from the Paiute settlement, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of emotions. Sadness at leaving the place where she had found so many answers. Anticipation about returning to Eagle Ridge to begin the next chapter, and a deep, abiding gratitude for the man beside her who had somehow become the center of her new world. The journey back to town was peaceful, the late summer landscape glowing golden in the afternoon sun. They traveled mostly in companionable silence, each lost in thought, occasionally pointing out a hawk soaring overhead or a deer watching warily from the edge of a meadow. As they crested the final hill overlooking Eagle Ridge, Harrison reined the horses to a stop just as he had days before when they first arrived together. The town looked different to Eleanor now. Not just a place of pain and humiliation, but a community with both shadows and light, a place where her father had made a difference and where she might do the same. Ready? Harrison asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, drawing strength from his presence beside her. Ready. Together they continued down the hill toward whatever awaited them in the town below. 6 months passed, bringing the harsh Montana winter and then the first tentative signs of spring. Eagle Ridge had changed during those months, not dramatically in appearance, but subtly in atmosphere. The arrest of Governor Blair and the exposure of the land fraud conspiracy had sent shockwaves through the territory, resulting in the removal of Mayor Holden and several town council members implicated in the scheme. The Sullivan Apothecary had reopened under Eleanor's management, expanded now to include a small clinic where she treated patients using both her nursing training and the herbal knowledge she had learned from Naomi Falling Water. The Paiute healer visited monthly, working alongside Eleanor and teaching her traditional remedies that complemented Western medicine. Harrison divided his time between his ranch and the town, gradually integrating the two worlds. Part of his land, the portion that had originally belonged to the Paiute, he had formally returned to the tribe while maintaining a cooperative arrangement that benefited both. Wolf Shadow and several other Paiute men worked seasonally at the ranch, and in return, Harrison provided resources and protection against those who might still challenge the tribe's treaty rights. The scandal surrounding Blair's administration had brought unexpected attention to the territory. Federal officials, journalists, and reformers arrived to investigate similar situations across the West, using the Montana case as a template for identifying corruption elsewhere. Eleanor found herself reluctantly thrust into public attention as the daughter of the whistleblower, whose evidence had exposed the conspiracy. Through it all, her relationship with Harrison deepened and strengthened. They faced the challenges together, the occasional hostility from those who had profited under the old regime, the curiosity of outsiders about their connection to the Paiute, the practical difficulties of balancing two households and two very different lifestyles. On a clear spring morning, Eleanor stood in the apothecary, organizing a new shipment of medicines that had arrived on the weekly stagecoach. The bell above the door jingled, and she looked up to see Dr. Winters entering his medical bag in hand. "Good morning, Eleanor," he greeted her cheerfully. "Thought I'd stop by on my rounds. Any interesting cases this week?" "Mrs. Peterson's youngest has a persistent cough," Eleanor replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "I gave her a syrup of wild cherry bark and honey, but if it doesn't improve by tomorrow, I'll send for you." Winters nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. Simple remedies first, then escalate if needed." He set his bag on the counter, his expression growing more serious. "I actually came by with some news. The territorial legislature has finally appointed a replacement for Blair. New governor arrives next week." Eleanor tensed slightly. "Anyone we know?" "Fellow named Richardson," Winters said. "Former Indian agent, apparently." "Samuel Richardson." Eleanor's face brightened. "The man who worked with Marshal Hollister on the Paiute land case." "That's him. Word is President Grant specifically requested his appointment because of his fair dealings with the native tribes and his role in exposing the land fraud." Eleanor smiled, relief evident in her expression. "That's excellent news. Richardson is a good man, principled, honest. The territory will be in much better hands." "He's requested a meeting with you when he arrives," Winters added. "Something about a territorial commission on Indian affairs. He wants your input given your unique position bridging the white and Paiute communities." "I'd be honored to help," Eleanor said, "though my unique position, as you call it, is still viewed with suspicion by some in town." Winters waved away her concern. "Those old prejudices are fading, Eleanor. People see the good you're doing here, the patients you're helping. Even Rebecca Holden comes to you now for her headache powders, and she was the biggest gossip about your scandalous arrangements with the Paiute." Eleanor laughed. "True enough, though I suspect her change of heart has more to do with your refusing to make house calls for minor ailments than any real shift in her thinking." The doctor chuckled, picking up his bag. "Perhaps so. Still, progress is progress, however it come." He headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and congratulations are in order, I hear. Harrison finally convinced you to set a date." A blush colored Eleanor's cheeks. "News travels fast. Yes, we're thinking early summer after the spring calving at the ranch is complete." "A sensible choice," Winters approved. "And will it be a traditional ceremony or—" "A combination," Shana replied. "Christian vows for the town's sake, but also a Paiute blessing at the ranch afterward. Thundering Bear will perform it." "Bridging worlds just as your father tried to do," Winters observed softly. "He would be proud, Eleanor. Very proud indeed." After the doctor left, Eleanor returned to her work, but her mind wandered to the upcoming wedding. The decision to marry Harrison had been easy made in her heart long before he formally asked. The logistics of merging their lives, however, presented challenges they were still navigating. The sound of horses outside drew her attention. Looking through the front window, she saw Harrison dismounting, tying his stallion to the hitching post. The sight of him still made her heart quicken, his tall figure moving with easy grace, the silver at his temples, catching the spring sunlight. The bell jingled again as he entered, bringing the scent of fresh air and leather with him. "Good morning," he said, smiling that rare smile that transformed his serious face. "Good morning yourself," she replied, coming around the counter to greet him properly with a kiss. "You're in town early today." "Had business at the bank," he explained. "Thought I'd stop by on my way back to the ranch." He glanced around the empty shop. "No patience." "Not yet. Mornings are usually quiet." She studied his face, noting a certain tension around his eyes. "Is everything all right? You seem preoccupied." Harrison hesitated, then nodded toward the back room. "Could we talk privately?" Concerned now, Eleanor led the way to her small office behind the dispensary. "What is it, James? Has something happened?" He paced the small space, uncharacteristically agitated. "I received a letter yesterday from Washington." Eleanor's concern deepened. "Washington? What do they want?" Harrison stopped pacing, turning to face her directly. "They've offered me a position. Deputy Federal Marshal for the Montana Territory, working directly under Hollister." "Oh," Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. "James, that's quite an honor." "It would mean moving to Helena," he continued, "leaving the ranch, or at least not being there most of the time, traveling throughout the territory." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized as signaling internal conflict. "I told myself I was done with that life, with authority, with making decisions that affect others' lives." Eleanor moved to him, taking both his hands in hers. "But something about this offer appeals to you." He nodded slowly. "Hollister says they need men who understand the territory, who have connections with the native tribes, who can navigate between worlds. The work would focus on protecting Indian rights, enforcing the new land regulations, ensuring the reforms we fought for actually take hold." "It sounds perfect for you," Eleanor said softly. "But what about us?" Harrison's gray eyes searched hers. "Our plans, the ranch, your apothecary here. I won't ask you to give up what you've built, Eleanor. And I don't want us to live separate lives." Eleanor considered this, the practical side of her mind already working through possibilities. "Helena isn't so far. The railroad makes the journey manageable. Perhaps I could divide my time, part of the month here, part there. Dr. Winters could cover my patients when I'm away." "You'd do that?" Harrison asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Of course I would," Eleanor replied simply. "This work matters to you. I can see it in your eyes. And it's important not just for us, but for everyone in the territory." Harrison pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I don't deserve you," he murmured against her hair. "Nonsense," she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "We deserve each other. All the pain, all the loss, it led us here to this moment, to these choices. Michael would approve, I think, and my father certainly would." Harrison drew back slightly to look at Dearman. "You're certain it would change our plans considerably?" "Life has changed, James," Eleanor said with a small smile. "If we've learned nothing else these past months, surely we've learned that. We'll make it work. Together." The tension eased from his face, replaced by a look of such tenderness that Eleanor felt her heart might burst. "Together," he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. The wedding took place on a perfect June day, the kind that seems to exist only in memory and dreams, blue sky stretching endlessly overhead, wildflowers carpeting the meadows surrounding Harrison's ranch, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and sage. The ceremony itself was held in the small church in Eagle Ridge, packed to capacity with townspeople, Paiute guests, and visitors from Helena, including Marshal Hollister and the new Governor Richardson. Dr. Winters gave Eleanor away, his weathered face beaming with paternal pride as he placed her hand in Harrison's. Eleanor wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her copper hair adorned with a crown of wildflowers gathered by Paiute children that morning. Harrison, resplendent in a new black suit, stood tall and straight, his gray eyes never leaving Eleanor's face as they exchanged their vows. "I, James, take you, Eleanor, to be my wife," he said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "To share in your joy and sorrow, to support your dreams as you have supported mine, to walk beside you through whatever lies ahead." "I, Eleanor, take you, James, to be my husband," she responded, her voice clear and sure. "To heal and be healed, to honor the past while building our future, to love you completely as long as we both shall live." The exchange of rings, the minister's blessing, the pronouncement of their union, all passed in a blur of joy and solemnity. And then they were walking back down the aisle together, husband and wife, at last into the bright June sunshine and the waiting future. The celebration continued at the ranch where long tables had been set up in the meadow. Paiute and white guests mingled freely, sharing food stories and laughter as the afternoon stretched into evening. Musicians played fiddles and guitars from the town drums and flutes from the Paiute settlement, creating a harmony that seemed to symbolize the union being celebrated. As dusk approached, Thundering Bear called for silence. The old man had dressed formally for the occasion in traditional Paiute attire, his white hair adorned with eagle feathers, his bearing regal, despite his years. "Now comes second ceremony," he announced. "Paiute blessing for Sullivan daughter and Harrison man, all welcome to witness." The guests gathered in a circle around a small fire that had been prepared in the center of the meadow. Harrison and Eleanor stood before Thundering Bear, hands joined as he spoke in the Paiute language, his deep voice rising and falling in cadences that needed no translation to convey their meaning. Naomi Fallingwater approached carrying a blanket of soft deerskin, elaborately beaded with symbols of union and prosperity. She draped it around the couple's shoulders, binding them together. "One path now," Thundering Bear said, switching to English. "Two people walk as one, under stars, under sun, in storm and calm. Ancestors watch, spirits bless." He took a pinch of dried herbs from a pouch at his waist, casting it into the fire. A sweet, pungent aroma rose with the smoke, spiraling upward into the darkening sky. "This smoke carries your oath to the heavens," he continued. "Stronger than words, deeper than promises. Soul knows soul." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple beauty of the ceremony, at the acceptance it represented, at the bringing together of worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. Thundering Bear placed his hands on their heads in blessing. "You build new path, good path. May children follow in your steps. May home be place of peace. May journey be long under Shadow Mountain's watch." As the ceremony concluded, the first stars appeared in the eastern sky. The celebration continued around them, but Harrison led Eleanor away from the crowd up a gentle slope to a vantage point overlooking the valley. From here, they could see both the ranch buildings and in the distance the smoke from cooking fires at the Paiute settlement. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said softly, leaning against her husband's side. "All of it." Harrison's arm tightened around her waist. "What shall we call it?" he asked. "This place, this valley we're building together." Eleanor considered the question, her gaze taking in the landscape bathed in the last golden light of day. "Promised land," she suggested finally, "not because it was given to us, but because of the promise we make to those who will come after, that this will be a place of justice, of healing, where the past is honored, but doesn't dictate the future." Harrison nodded, the name settling between them with the rightness of truth long sought. "Promised land," he repeated. "Yes, I think that fits." As darkness deepened over the Montana landscape, they made their way back to the celebration, where two communities once divided by history and circumstance now danced together under the vast sky, not forgetting the wounds of the past, but choosing to build something new upon their scars. In the years that followed, the story of Eleanor Sullivan and James Harrison became part of the valley's lore, a tale of justice pursued at great cost, of redemption found in unlikely places, and of an oath made not with words but with lives dedicated to a vision of what the American frontier could truly become, a promised land earned through sacrifice and protected by those who understood its true value.